The workshop smelled of defeat. Not the clean, sharp scent of fresh metal or the earthy tang of coal, but the stale, musty odor of dreams left to rot. Dust motes danced in a single shaft of afternoon light that managed to pierce the grimy window of Leo's forge, illuminating the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving blacksmith's workshop. Leo sat on a stool that creaked under his weight, his calloused hands resting on his knees. They were good hands, strong and steady, with the permanent blackened stains of a lifetime at the forge. But today, they trembled slightly. Not from fear or excitement, but from a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had settled into his marrow over the past 3 years. His eyes traveled the room. The anvil in the center, once polished to a mirror shine, now wore a coat of rust like a shameful secret. The bellows hung limp and torn. Shelves that had once displayed gleaming swords and sturdy armor stood empty, save for a few forgotten tools and a thick layer of dust. The only thing that looked new was the gacha machine in the corner, a brass anwood contraption with a polished lever and a chute that spat out disappointment. 10,000 times. The number echoed in Leo's skull like a funeral bell. 10,000 pulls on various gacha machines across the city, or gachas for materials, tool gachas for equipment, even the bread gacha down the street when he'd been desperate enough to try for a meal. 10,000 consecutive failures. He'd started keeping count after the first 1,000, scratching marks on the wall behind his workbench. The marks had long since filled the available space, becoming a chaotic mosaic of his misfortune. The other smiths in the district had laughed at first, then pitied him, then avoided him altogether. Bad luck, they whispered, was contagious. Leo the Unlucky, they called him behind his back. The man who could turn gold into slag just by looking at it. His last copper coin felt heavy in his palm. Not the comfortable weight of good metal, but the leaden burden of finality. He'd sold everything, his spare tools, his winter cloak, even his mother's silver locket. This coin was all that remained between him and complete destitution. Leo stood, his joints protesting the movement. He walked to the junk or gacha machine, the cheapest pull in the district. For 1 copper, you got exactly what you paid for, worthless slag, useless rock, maybe if you were exceptionally lucky, a fragment of low-grade iron ore. He'd pulled this particular machine 3,427 times. He knew because he'd counted every single one. His fingers closed around the lever. The brass was cool to the touch, worn smooth by 10,000 other desperate hands. He could feel the mechanisms inside, the tumblers, the randomizer crystals, the whole elaborate system designed to give hope and deliver despair in equal measure. For a moment, he hesitated. He could keep the coin. Buy a loaf of stale bread. Survive another day. But what was the point? His workshop was bankrupt. His reputation was ashes. The loan sharks would be coming soon anyway, and they wouldn't be satisfied with a single copper. No. Better to go out with one last pull. One final, spiteful middle finger to the universe that had cursed him. Leo took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and regret. Then he pulled the lever. The machine whirred to life, gears grinding, crystals humming with magical energy. A light flashed, blue, always blue for failure, and a chunk of dark gray slag tumbled out of the chute. It hit the wooden floor with a dull thud that seemed to echo in the silent workshop. 10,001. Something inside Leo broke. Not suddenly, like glass shattering, but slowly, like a dam giving way after years of pressure. The exhaustion, the shame, the anger, all of it coalesced into a white-hot rage that burned away everything else. He stared at the slag. Common, worthless, exactly like the 9,999 pieces before it. This was what 10,000 coppers had bought him. This was what 3 years of his life had amounted to. A pile of rocks and the laughter of his peers. No more, he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. Then he roared. Leo grabbed the nearest heavy object, a rusted hammer he hadn't used in months, and brought it down on the gacha machine with all his strength. Brass dented. Wood splintered. The sound was deafening in the small space. He struck again, and again, each blow fueled by 3 years of pent-up frustration. The polished lever snapped off. The chute bent at a grotesque angle. Glass crystals shattered, scattering magical residue across the floor like glittering dust. He didn't stop until the machine was a ruin of twisted metal and broken wood, until his arms ached and sweat dripped from his brow. He stood panting over the wreckage, the broken hammer still clutched in his hand. And that's when the world glitched. The air in the workshop grew heavy, charged with an energy Leo had never felt before. The scattered crystal fragments on the floor began to glow, not with their usual blue failure light, but with a deep, pulsating gold. The light grew brighter, coalescing into strands that snaked through the air like living things. From the wreckage of the gacha machine, a voice spoke. Not with sound, but directly into Leo's mind, a deep, resonant tone that vibrated in his bones. Statistical anomaly detected. 10,000 consecutive failures. Guaranteed ultimate pity protocol activated. Overriding system constraints. Forcing pity drop. The golden light intensified, blindingly bright. Leo shielded his eyes, but the light seemed to penetrate through his hands, through his very flesh. He could feel something changing in the workshop, in the air, in himself. The randomizer crystals in the broken machine weren't just shattered, they were being rewritten, their fundamental programming overwritten by something older and far more powerful. When the light finally faded, Leo lowered his hands. Floating in the air where the gacha machine had been was a hammer. But no ordinary hammer. This was a thing of beauty and power, about 2 feet long from pommel to head. The handle was dark, polished wood that seemed to drink the light, inlaid with silver runes that glowed with a soft, internal luminescence. The head was forged from a metal Leo had never seen before, not steel, not iron, not even mithril. It was a deep, shifting color that seemed to be all colors at once, like oil on water or the heart of a flame. One face was flat for striking, the other tapered to a sharp point. As Leo watched, the hammer drifted toward him. Not falling, but moving with deliberate purpose. It rotated slowly in the air, the runes on the handle pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He reached out, his hand trembling for a different reason now. The moment his fingers closed around the handle, knowledge flooded into him. Not in words, but in sensations, in understanding that bypassed language entirely. He knew this hammer. Not just what it was, but who had wielded it. A smithing god from before the gacha systems, before the randomizers and the pity counters and the entire economy of chance. A deity who had shaped mountains and tempered stars, whose forge had birthed the first metals in the world. And he knew what the hammer could do. Guaranteed ultimate pity. The cheat hidden so deep in the system that only someone with legendary bad luck could ever trigger it. 10,000 failures wasn't just misfortune, it was a statistical impossibility. A flaw in reality itself. And the system, faced with such an anomaly, had no choice but to break its own rules. Leo hefted the hammer. It was perfectly balanced, feeling like an extension of his own arm. The weight was substantial but not burdensome, like it had been made for him alone. He needed to test it. To see if what he understood was real. His eyes fell on a piece of scrap metal in the corner, a broken hinge from his workshop door that he'd been meaning to repair. Worthless iron, pitted with rust. He placed it on his anvil, raised the divine hammer, and brought it down. The sound wasn't the familiar clang of metal on metal. It was deeper, more resonant, like a bell tolling in a cathedral. Light erupted from the point of impact, not the golden light from before, but a fierce, angry red that seemed to burn without heat. When Leo lifted the hammer, the scrap metal was gone. In its place was a lump of ore unlike anything he'd ever seen. It glowed with that same angry red light, pulsing like a heartbeat. The surface wasn't smooth like most ores, but jagged and sharp, as if it had been forged from pure spite given physical form. He picked it up. It was warm to the touch, and heavier than it looked. As he turned it in his hands, understanding came again. Spite ore. A legendary material that shouldn't exist. Forged not from the earth, but from 10,000 failures and the rage that followed. It held within it the concentrated essence of every disappointment, every laughed-at dream, every copper wasted. And it was his. Leo stared at the glowing ore, his mind racing. With this, with the hammer. He could craft something. Something real. Something that would prove he wasn't just Leo the unlucky. That his hands still had value. That 10,000 failures could be worth something after all. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't hear the footsteps at first. Not until they were right outside his workshop door. Then the door exploded inward. Splinters of wood flew across the room as the doorframe shattered under a heavy boot. 3 men stood in the doorway, backlit by the fading afternoon light. They were big, rough-looking types with the hardened eyes of people who made their living from other people's misery. The one in front, a bald man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, stepped into the workshop. His eyes scanned the room, the destroyed gacha machine, the glowing ore in Leo's hand, the divine hammer at his side. A slow, ugly smile spread across the man's face. "Well, well," he said, his voice like gravel. "Looks like retirement's been treating you well, Leo. Got some shiny new toys, I see." His two companions fanned out, blocking the exits. Their hands rested on the clubs at their belts. "We heard you made a commotion," the bald man continued, taking another step forward. His eyes never left the spider. "The boss was worried you might be trying to skip town without settling your debts. But it looks like you've been holding out on us." He reached out a thick-fingered hand. "Why don't you hand that over? Might knock a copper or two off what you owe." Leo's grip tightened on the ore. The red glow seemed to pulse brighter, as if responding to his anger. The divine hammer felt warm in his other hand, the runes glowing faintly. For the first time in 3 years, Leo didn't feel afraid. He felt something else entirely. He met the lone shark's eyes. "No," he said, and his voice didn't tremble at all. The workshop smelled of desperation, a familiar scent that had clung to Leo's clothes for months. But now, mingled with the usual odors of cold ash and rust, was something new, the sharp, metallic tang of the spider glowing on his anvil, and the heavy musk of 3 men who'd come to take what little he had left. Kale, the bald enforcer, stood closest, his knuckles white around the hilt of a cheap iron sword. His eyes, flat and predatory, didn't leave the ore. "That's payment, Blacksmith," he said, voice like gravel grinding. "Your debts are overdue. Hand it over, and we might let you keep the roof over your head." Behind him, Rourke shifted his weight, muscles bunching under a stained tunic. He didn't speak, but his presence filled the cramped space, a wall of threat. Finn, lean and wiry, hovered near the broken gacha machine, his gaze darting between Leo and the door, a lookout waiting for trouble. Leo's hands trembled. Not from fear, though fear was there, cold in his gut, but from exhaustion. The divine hammer felt heavier than any tool he'd ever held, its weight both physical and symbolic. He'd spent a lifetime failing, 10,000 pulls yielding nothing but slag and mockery. Now, with this glowing ore and strange hammer, he had something to lose again. His fingers tightened around the hammer's haft, the wood warm against his palm, as if alive with forgotten power. "It's not yours," Leo said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. He took a step back, putting the anvil between himself and Kale. The workshop was a mess, tools scattered from his earlier rage, the gacha machine's broken gears glittering in the dim light filtering through grimy windows. But the spider drew the eye, pulsing with a faint, angry light, like a heartbeat forged from misfortune. Rourke chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Think you can stop us, old man? You couldn't even pull a decent ore from a machine." Leo's jaw clenched. The insult was nothing new, he'd heard variations for years, but today it burned differently. He glanced at the hammer. In his mind's eye, he saw the brief vision that had come with it, a forgotten god shaping stars into tools, a promise of creation born from failure. The hammer had a passive effect, a minor crafting boost the divine presence had whispered into his thoughts. It wouldn't make him faster or stronger in a fight, but it could guide his hands, refine his work beyond mortal skill. If he could just use it. Kale took another step, sword raising. "Last chance. The ore, or we take it and break a few bones for interest." Leo's resolve hardened, crystallizing like cooled metal. He wasn't a fighter, he was a blacksmith, a creator. But maybe he didn't need to be. His eyes darted to the ore, then to the hammer. An idea formed, reckless and desperate. If he could forge something here, now, using the boost, it might be enough to shock them, to buy time. "Fine," Leo said, voice dropping to a whisper. He set the hammer down on the anvil with a soft thud, the sound echoing in the tense silence. "But let me show you what this ore is worth first. A demonstration." Finn's eyes narrowed. "What trick is this?" "No trick," Leo said, forcing calm into his voice. He picked up a pair of tongs, his movements deliberate. The spider was warm to the touch, humming with latent energy. He placed it on the anvil, the glow casting eerie shadows across the men's faces. Then he grabbed the divine hammer again. As his fingers closed around it, the minor crafting boost activated, not as a flashy light or roar, but as a subtle shift in perception. The ore's structure became clear in his mind, layers of compressed misfortune, waiting to be shaped. His fatigue, the deep weariness from years of struggle, seemed to sharpen into focus, fueling his hands. He took a breath, the air tasting of metal and sweat. Kale watched, suspicion etched on his face, but he didn't move. Curiosity, or greed, held him still. Leo brought the hammer down. The strike rang through the workshop, a clear, resonant note that felt older than the stones beneath them. The ore didn't flatten like ordinary metal, it flowed, liquid and eager, under the blow. Leo's arms ached immediately, the process was draining, burning through his remaining stamina as if drawing from his very soul. Each swing required focus, each tap of the hammer guided by that divine boost, aligning the ore's chaotic energy into a form. He worked fast, years of blacksmithing instinct merging with the hammer's guidance. The spike ore reshaped into a blade, short, dagger-like, its edges forming with unnatural sharpness even as he forged. Sweat dripped from his brow, sizzling on the anvil. His breaths came in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. This was his answer, his first act of defiance since the pity drop. Rourke shifted, uneasy. "Boss, this is taking too long." Kale held up a hand, eyes locked on the dagger. It was taking shape, glowing brighter with each strike, a faint aura beginning to shimmer around it, a pale, silver light that spoke of cut misfortune and sharpened resolve. Finally, with a last, exhausted swing, Leo finished. He plunged the dagger into a nearby water trough, steam hissing up in a cloud. When he pulled it out, the blade gleamed, perfect and deadly. The aura clung to it, subtle but undeniable. Leo leaned against the anvil, chest heaving, his strength spent. But the dagger in his hand felt alive, an extension of his will. "Pretty," Kale sneered, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "Now hand it over." He lunged, sword swinging in a clumsy arc. Leo, driven by instinct more than skill, raised the dagger to parry. The collision was silent for a heartbeat, then the cheap iron sword shattered, fragments scattering across the floor like broken teeth. The dagger hadn't just blocked, it had sliced through the metal as if it were parchment, leaving Kale holding a jagged stump. The enforcer stumbled back, shock wiping the cruelty from his face. "What in the abyss?" Rourke muttered, taking a step back himself. Leo straightened, though his legs trembled. He held the dagger before him, its aura brightening in the dim light. "I told you," he said, voice steadier now. "It's not yours." Kale stared at the broken sword, then at Leo, then at the dagger. Fear, raw and sudden, flashed in his eyes. This wasn't just a weapon, it was something beyond his understanding, something that broke the rules of their gacha world where quality was a lottery. He backed toward the door, Rourke and Finn following, their bravado evaporated. "This isn't over," Kale spat, but the threat sounded hollow. They fled into the muddy street, leaving Leo alone with his creation and his hammer. For a long moment, Leo just breathed, the adrenaline ebbing away to leave a deep, weary satisfaction. He examined the dagger. It was beautiful in a fierce way, the blade held an edge so fine it seemed to cut the light, and the aura pulsed gently, a reminder of its origin. He had a weapon now, and more importantly, he had proof. His misfortune could be weaponized. But debts remained. He needed coin, and fast. Wrapping the dagger in a scrap of cloth, he stumbled out of the workshop, the divine hammer left safely inside. The town outside was bustling, a typical day of gacha pulls and disappointed sighs. He made his way to the main square, where merchants hawked their wares and hopefuls fed coins into machines. His eyes landed on a merchant he vaguely recognized, a man named Oren, who dealt in oddities and rare finds. Oren was examining a set of carved bones, his expression bored. Leo approached, the dagger hidden under the cloth. "Need to sell something," Leo said, his voice still rough from exertion. Oren glanced up, recognition dawning. "Leo? Heard you retired. What have you got, more slag?" Leo unwrapped the dagger. The aura flared slightly in the sunlight, drawing Oren's full attention. The merchant's eyes widened, his bored demeanor vanishing. He took the dagger, hands careful, and tested the edge against a copper coin he pulled from his pocket. The coin split cleanly in two. "By the gods," Oren whispered. What is this? Where'd you get it? Made it, Leo said simply. Oren's gaze sharpened, calculating. He knew Leo's reputation, the unluckiest blacksmith in town, but this dagger defied that. After a moment of silent appraisal, he named a price. It was a small fortune, enough to pay off Leo's remaining debts and leave a hefty sum besides. Leo agreed, too tired to haggle. As coins changed hands, Oren's demeanor shifted again. A gleam entered his eye, the look of a man who saw opportunity. This will cause a stir, he said, almost to himself. Then louder, to the gathering crowd that had noticed the exchange, behold. A dagger forged by the cursed blacksmith, sharper than any gacha blade. He held it up, the aura catching the light, drawing gasps and murmurs. Leo felt a prickle of unease. He hadn't expected this, a public spectacle. People pressed closer, curious faces asking questions he didn't answer. He pocketed the coins, the weight of them foreign and reassuring, and turned to leave. But as he pushed through the crowd, he caught sight of a man watching from the edge of the square. The man was well dressed in fine but understated clothes, his posture relaxed but eyes sharp. He wasn't part of the gawking mass, he observed with detached interest, like a scholar studying a specimen. When his gaze met Leo's, it held no curiosity, only calculation, a cold assessment of value and threat. The man didn't approach, but he didn't look away either. He was a noble's agent, Leo realized with a sinking feeling. Silas, if the rumors were right, working for Baron Vex. The agent's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile before he melted back into the crowd, leaving Leo standing there as whispers spread around him. The dagger's sale had paid his debts, but it had also drawn eyes, hungry, greedy eyes that saw not a man, but a resource to be controlled. The morning sun filtered through the grimy workshop windows, casting long shadows across the forge that had been silent for months. Leo stirred from his makeshift bed in the corner, the straw mattress rustling beneath him. His body ached from yesterday's exertion, the frantic forging, the confrontation, the desperate sale. But something else pulled him from sleep, a low, persistent murmur from outside. He rose, stretching stiff muscles, and peered through a crack in the boarded-up window. The sight made him freeze. The narrow street outside his workshop was packed. Dozens of townsfolk clustered together, their voices rising in a cacophony of demands and curiosity. Merchants in fine tunics pushed through the crowd, their eyes scanning the workshop's exterior with calculating intensity. Children perched on parents' shoulders, pointing at the door where just yesterday Oren had displayed the spider dagger for all to see. "Open up, blacksmith," a burly man shouted, pounding on the door. "I'll pay double what Oren offered," cried a merchant with silver rings on every finger. "Just one more item." "One more." Leo stepped back from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't gratitude or admiration, it was hunger. The same desperate hunger that had driven him to pull that gacha lever 10,000 times. They'd seen the dagger's unnatural sharpness, heard how it shattered a lone shark's sword, and now they wanted their own piece of miracle. The door rattled on its hinges. Leo moved to brace it, his hands trembling not from fear but from the sheer weight of what he'd unleashed. The divine hammer lay on his workbench, its surface catching the morning light in ways no ordinary metal should. It seemed to hum with quiet anticipation. A new voice cut through the chaos outside, smooth, controlled, and utterly cold. "Clear the way." The crowd parted like wheat before a scythe. Through the window crack, Leo saw Silas approaching. The noble's agent wore the same fine clothes as yesterday, but today he carried a polished walking stick that tapped rhythmically against the cobblestones. 2 armed guards flanked him, their presence enough to silence the most vocal merchants. Silas stopped before the workshop door. He didn't pound or shout. He simply waited, his expression unreadable. Leo took a deep breath, then unbarred the door. The morning light flooded in, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The crowd surged forward, but Silas raised a single hand, and his guards stepped between them and the doorway. "Leo," Silas said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the restless murmurs. "We should speak privately." He stepped inside without waiting for invitation. His guards remained outside, forming a human barrier against the crowd. Silas closed the door himself, shutting out the noise and leaving them in the workshop's dim interior. For a long moment, Silas simply observed. His eyes traveled over the cold forge, the scattered tools, the divine hammer on the bench. They lingered on the hammer a beat too long. "You've caused quite a stir," Silas said at last, turning to face Leo. "That dagger of yours. Oren has been showing it to every noble within riding distance. He's already received 3 offers to purchase it at 5 times what he paid you." Leo said nothing. He kept his hands at his sides, resisting the urge to reach for the hammer. "Baron Vex has taken notice," Silas continued, pacing slowly around the workshop. His walking stick tapped against the stone floor. "His lordship controls all gacha sales in this region. Every machine, every pull, every tax on winnings. It's a delicate system. Profitable. Stable." He stopped before Leo, his gaze sharp as broken glass. "Your little miracle threatens that stability. Already, our merchants are refusing to sell their low-tier stock. They're holding out, hoping you'll create another legendary item and drive prices higher. The common folk are hoarding their coppers instead of spending them on daily pulls. They're waiting to see what you do next." "I just made a dagger," Leo said, his voice rough from disuse. "You made a legend," Silas corrected. "And legends have value. More value than you can possibly manage alone." He gestured toward the door with his walking stick. "Baron Vex is prepared to offer you a partnership. Exclusive rights to sell anything you create through his channels. Protection from less civilized elements. A percentage of profits that would make you a wealthy man." Silas leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried in the quiet workshop. "Or you can refuse. And discover what happens when you disrupt a system that has made very powerful men very rich." The threat hung between them, tangible as the dust in the air. Leo looked past Silas to the divine hammer. He remembered the 10,000 failures. The despair. The moment the light had erupted from the broken gacha machine. This wasn't a partnership being offered, it was a leash. Another form of control in a world built on chance and exploitation. "No," Leo said. Silas's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes. "Think carefully, Blacksmith." "I have." Leo met his gaze. "Tell Baron Vex I'm not interested in partnerships." For a heartbeat, Silas looked as though he might say more. Then he simply nodded, a cold, precise motion. "As you wish." He turned, opened the door, and stepped back into the morning light. The crowd surged forward with questions, but Silas ignored them, his guards clearing a path as he walked away without looking back. The merchants immediately tried to press into the workshop, but Leo barred the door again, their disappointed shouts muffled by thick wood. Alone once more, Leo leaned against the door, breathing heavily. His hands shook. He'd just refused a noble's agent. In this world, that was madness. But the alternative, becoming another cog in Vex's machine, felt like a different kind of death. He needed to move. To act. Before Silas returned with more than threats. Leo gathered the coins from yesterday's sale, a heavy pouch that clinked with promise. He counted out enough for his immediate needs, then slipped out the workshop's back entrance, through the alley that smelled of damp stone and refuse. The town square bustled with morning activity. At its center stood the gacha machines, row upon row of them, gleaming with polished brass and enchanted glass. Ore gachas for metals and minerals. Herb gachas for alchemical ingredients. Weapon gachas for pre-made arms. Even food gachas for daily sustenance. People queued before them, their faces etched with the same desperate hope Leo had worn for years. They inserted coins, pulled levers, and watched as the machines dispensed their random rewards. Most walked away with common herbs or low-grade ore. A few wept over something rarer. Leo approached the junk or gacha first, the same model he destroyed yesterday. He inserted a copper coin, the machine's mechanisms whirring to life. The lever felt familiar in his hand. He pulled. A chunk of worthless slag clattered into the collection tray. Failure number 10,001. He didn't feel disappointment. He felt purpose. Each failure brought him closer to the next pity drop. To the next divine material. To the sword that would require 10,000 more failures. Leo moved down the line, methodically spending coins. Junk ore after junk ore. Common herbs that were little more than weeds. He accumulated nothing of value, and with each pull, he marked the count in his mind. 10,002, 10,003. 10,004. Merchants watched him from their stalls. Whispers followed him through the square. That's him. The blacksmith. What's he doing wasting coin on junk pulls? Maybe he's lost his mind again. Leo ignored them. He purchased a small cartload of the most common or available iron of such low quality it was barely worth smelting. Then he returned to his workshop, barring the door against the still lurking crowd. For the rest of the day, he worked. Not with the divine hammer, but with ordinary tools. He stoked the forge until it glowed cherry red. He hammered the cheap iron into simple tools, nails, hinges, a replacement handle for a broken shovel. His muscles remembered the rhythms of ordinary smithing, the sweat and heat and repetitive motion. But his mind was elsewhere. With each hammer strike, he calculated. The dagger had sold for enough to pay his debts and leave him with substantial capital. But more importantly, it had changed something. Silas had said or merchants were holding stock. Prices were spiking. The mere possibility of another legendary item was warping the local economy. Leo paused, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at the divine hammer where it rested on its bench. This wasn't just about crafting powerful items. It was about leverage. About creating scarcity and demand. About turning the gacha system's own randomness against itself. He'd spent years as its victim. Now he held a tool that could make him its master. As evening fell, Leo finished his last ordinary hinge and set it aside. He'd crafted nothing remarkable, but the work had served its purpose, it maintained appearances. To anyone watching, he was just a blacksmith trying to rebuild his business. But the failures accumulated. 10,005, 10,006. 10,007. A long way to go. But a start. He ate a simple meal of bread and dried meat, then banked the forge's fire. The workshop settled into darkness, broken only by moonlight through the windows. Exhaustion pulled at him, but sleep felt dangerous. Silas's warning echoed in the quiet. Leo finally lay down on his straw mattress, the divine hammer within arm's reach. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the night sounds of the town, distant laughter, the occasional shout, the ever-present hum of gacha machines in the square. His eyes grew heavy. The day's exertions dragged him toward sleep despite his fears. He didn't hear the back window being forced open. Didn't hear the soft footsteps on the stone floor. Didn't wake until cold air washed over him. Leo's eyes snapped open. Moonlight revealed shadows moving through his workshop. 2 figures, maybe 3. They moved with practiced silence, gathering tools from his benches. His newly crafted hinges. His hammers and tongs. Everything of value except the divine hammer, which lay beside him. He stayed still, breathing shallowly, watching through slitted eyes. The figures worked quickly. They loaded tools into sacks, then slipped back through the window. One of them paused before leaving. Leo saw the glint of something being placed on his workbench. Then they were gone. Leo waited until the street outside fell silent again. Then he rose, lighting a single candle with trembling hands. The workshop had been stripped. His ordinary tools, the accumulation of a blacksmith's lifetime, were gone. Only the divine hammer remained, along with his cart of cheap ore and the few coins he hadn't spent. On the workbench lay a folded piece of parchment. Leo picked it up, the paper crisp and expensive. The handwriting was elegant, precise, utterly without warmth. 3 words. Join or be ruined. No signature. None was needed. The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows across the empty workshop. Outside, the town slept, unaware of the theft. Unaware of the war that had just declared its first skirmish. Leo stared at the note, then at the divine hammer. The tool that could break systems. The tool that had drawn a noble's wrath. He didn't feel fear. Not anymore. He felt the first stirrings of something darker. Something forged in 10,000 failures and tempered by threat. Somewhere in the night, a gacha machine in the square dispensed another worthless prize to another desperate soul. The sound was barely audible through the workshop walls. Failure number 10,008. Leo smiled in the darkness. The morning light filtering through the broken window of Leo's workshop illuminated the emptiness where his tools had once been. He stood in the center of the room, the divine hammer resting against his thigh, its weight both comforting and terrifying. The note, "Join or be ruined," lay crumpled on the floor where he'd thrown it hours earlier. His fingers traced the smooth wood of the hammer's handle, feeling the faint warmth that seemed to pulse in response to his touch. Leo's eyes scanned the workshop methodically. The forge stood cold, its firebox empty. The anvil, too heavy to steal, sat like a silent sentinel. Shelves that had once held tongs, hammers, chisels, and files now gaped bare. Only the divine hammer remained, along with his hidden ledger and the small pouch of coins from the dagger sale. He knelt, pulling a loose floorboard near the forge's foundation. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, lay his ledger, a simple leather-bound book where he'd begun recording his failures. The last entry read, 10,007. He flipped to a fresh page, his charcoal pencil hovering. "They want to ruin me," he thought, the words forming with cold clarity. "But ruin is my specialty." A grim smile touched his lips. If Baron Vex's agent thought stealing ordinary tools would stop him, they didn't understand what he'd become. The divine hammer required no tongs, no files. It shaped metal with will as much as force. But the theft revealed something more dangerous than violence: surveillance. Silas knew his movements. The workshop was being watched. Leo packed quickly. He wrapped the divine hammer in coarse burlap, disguising its shape as a bundle of firewood. His coin pouch went into an inner pocket of his worn leather apron. The ledger he slipped into a waxed canvas satchel along with a water skin, hard bread, and a wedge of cheese. He left through the back alley, moving with the practiced silence of a man who'd spent years avoiding creditors. The morning market was beginning to stir, carts rattling over cobblestones, but Leo kept to shadows, his eyes scanning for familiar faces: bald Cale, muscular Rourke, lean Finn, or worse, Silas with his calculating gaze. He reached the northern gate as the sun cleared the rooftops. The guard, a man named Garrett with a perpetual squint, barely glanced at Leo's bundle. "Off to scavenge, Blacksmith?" Garrett asked, his tone dismissive. Leo nodded, not trusting his voice. The guard waved him through. Beyond the walls, the road split three ways. Leo chose the western path toward Greenroot Village, a farming settlement known for its herb gacha machines. Each step away from town felt like shedding a weight. The air smelled of damp earth and wild thyme, not the metallic tang of gacha machines and desperation. Greenroot Village lay 6 miles west, a cluster of thatched cottages surrounded by fields of barley and root vegetables. Leo arrived by midday, his legs aching. The village square held 3 gacha machines, one for common herbs, one for farming tools, and one for blessed seeds, a local specialty with abysmal rates. A farmer was cursing at the herb machine, having pulled 3 consecutive bundles of wilted mint. Leo waited until the man stormed off, then approached. He fed copper coins into the herb gacha, each clink sounding like a heartbeat. The machine whirred, its mechanisms grinding with worn gears. A packet dropped into the tray: common sage, dried, low potency. Leo didn't open it. He simply recorded 10,008 in his ledger, tucked the packet into his satchel, and fed another coin. 10,009, wild thyme, poor quality. 10,010, wilted mint. He worked methodically, 20 pulls in succession, each failure noted. The machine grew warm under his hands, as if protesting the statistical anomaly of his presence. Villagers began to stare, whispering about the stranger wasting coin on guaranteed disappointment. An old farmer with hands like gnarled oak approached. "You're the one from Stonebridge," the farmer said, not unkindly. "Heard about that dagger. Fancy work." Leo paused, meeting the man's eyes. "I need to use your machines," he said simply. The farmer nodded toward a broken plow leaning against the smithy shed. "Fix that, you can pull all day." "My name's Harl." Leo examined the plow. The iron share had cracked along a weak seam. With ordinary tools, it would require reforging. But the divine hammer hummed in his hands as he unwrapped it. He didn't need a forge, he focused on the break, feeling the metal's memory through the hammer. A single tap, infused with the minor crafting boost, flowed like liquid light along the crack. The iron knit itself together, stronger than before. Harl's eyes widened. Never seen smithing like that, he murmured. You're welcome here, blacksmith. The shed's yours to sleep in if you need. Over 3 days, Leo pulled on Greenroot's machines each morning, accumulating failures. He helped Harl repair a harness, fixed a neighbor's cooking pot, and even tuned the village's sole farming tool gacha when it jammed, earning more goodwill and a hidden corner in the shed to store his growing collection of failed pulls. By the time he left, his ledger read 10,158. Harl pressed a small pouch of dried apples into his hand. Silas's men came asking, the farmer warned quietly. Baron Vex agent. They're buying up gacha rights in every village. Watch your back. Leo traveled northeast to Millcross, a village built around a water wheel and known for its gacha, mostly low-grade iron and copper. Here, the machines were newer, gleaming with brass fittings. The overseer, a sharp-faced woman named Lyra, charged double for pulls, citing premium maintenance. Leo paid without complaint, pulling 30 times on the gacha. Each yielded pebbles or slag. 10,159 through 10,188. Lyra watched him with greedy interest, but when he offered to adjust the water wheel's grinding stone, using the divine hammer to true its surface in minutes, she lowered her rates for the remainder of his stay. In Millcross, he learned more. Silas wasn't just an agent, he was Baron Vex's chief enforcer for gacha monopolies. The Baron owned the distribution rights to every machine in the region, taking a cut of every pull. Those who resisted found their supplies mysteriously contaminated or their licenses revoked. Leo recorded this in his ledger, not just failures but notes on the Baron's network. He slept in the mill's loft, the steady groan of the water wheel masking his thoughts. When he left, his failure count stood at 10,245. The third village, Ashford, lay in a wooded valley. Its gacha machines were ancient, rust-pitted things offering forest blessings, mostly twigs and moss. Leo arrived at dusk, the woods thick with shadows. He pulled 40 times on the moss gacha, the machine coughing like an old man. 10,246 to 10,285. As he recorded the last failure, a group of children gathered, fascinated by his ledger. One boy, no older than 8, said, "Mister, why do you keep pulling if you always lose?" Leo looked at the boy's threadbare tunic, at the hollows under his eyes. Because sometimes, Leo said softly, losing enough means you win something bigger. The boy didn't understand, but he brought Leo a bowl of stew from his mother's pot. In Ashford, Leo heard the rumor first. A traveling peddler spoke of a cursed artifact in Stonebridge, a hammer that glowed with stolen luck, wielded by a bankrupt blacksmith turned thief. The peddler didn't know Leo's name, but the description was unmistakable. Leo finished his pulls quickly, reaching 10,305 before dawn. He slipped away as the village woke, his satchel heavier with failed packets, his mind racing. The journey back to Stonebridge took 2 days. Leo avoided main roads, sleeping under hedges, his dreams filled with whirring gacha gears and Silas's cold smile. He practiced with the divine hammer during breaks, shaping fallen branches into precise tools, not with magic, but with the enhanced control the hammer granted. His stamina still burned quickly with the minor crafting boost, but he was learning to pace it, to feel the energy like a second heartbeat. He approached Stonebridge from the east, circling to the hills above the town. From this vantage, he could see his workshop's roof, the forge chimney standing like a stubby finger against the sunset. And he saw them, 2 figures in Baron Vex livery, forest green with a silver coin emblem, stationed at either end of his street. They weren't hiding, they stood openly, arms crossed, watching the workshop's door. Townsfolk gave them a wide berth. Leo crouched behind a boulder, his breath fogging in the cool evening air. He counted the guards, 2 visible, possibly more nearby. His workshop wasn't just watched, it was under guard. As dusk deepened, a 3rd man arrived, speaking with the guards. Even from this distance, Leo recognized Silas's precise movements. The agent pointed toward the workshop, then toward the town square, his gestures sharp. One of the guards nodded and began walking toward the market district. Leo waited until full dark, then descended the hill using goat paths he remembered from childhood. He entered Stonebridge through the tanner's quarter, where the stench of chemicals masked his scent. Moving alley to alley, he reached the rear of his workshop. The back door hung slightly ajar, forced open again. He slipped inside, the darkness absolute. His fingers found the divine hammer where he'd hidden it beneath a pile of scrap metal. The workshop had been searched thoroughly, even the floorboards near the forge were pried up. But they hadn't found his latest hiding spot. He lit a single candle, shielding its flame with his hand. In the flickering light, he saw fresh chalk marks on the walls, crude symbols he didn't recognize, perhaps meant to track cursed energy. And on his workbench, where the note had been, now lay a single silver coin, Baron Vex's emblem facing up. Outside, voices drifted from the street. Cursed artifact, they say. Blacksmith's hoarding it. Baron's offering a reward for information. The rumors were spreading, twisting. Leo blew out the candle, sitting in the dark. His ledger, pulled from his satchel, felt solid in his hands. He opened it to the last page, 10,305. 500 failures added, just as he'd planned. But the cost was clear. He wasn't just a laughingstock anymore, he was a target. And the divine hammer, warm against his leg, felt less like a tool and more like a beacon. The morning sun cast long shadows across Stonebridge's cobblestone streets as Leo slipped through the back alleys, the weight of Baron Vex's surveillance pressing on him like a physical burden. He kept his head down, the divine hammer wrapped in coarse cloth and tucked under his arm. The guards outside his workshop had been replaced overnight, 2 new faces with the same cold, watchful eyes. They didn't follow him, but their presence was a constant reminder that his movements were being tracked. Leo's destination was a modest clinic on the eastern edge of town, nestled between a tanner's shop and a weaver's stall. He'd met Alara briefly in Greenroot Village during his travels, when he'd stopped to pull from her herb gacha machine. She'd been the only person who hadn't looked at him with pity or mockery when he'd failed yet another pull. Instead, her expression had held a familiar, simmering resentment. The clinic sign, carved with a simple leaf motif, creaked in the breeze. The air here smelled of drying herbs and earth, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of his own workshop. He knocked twice, the sound hollow against the wooden door. After a moment, it opened just enough to reveal Alara's face, sharp-featured, with intelligent green eyes that immediately narrowed in recognition. She was younger than he remembered, perhaps in her late 20s, with calloused hands that spoke of constant work. "Leo," she said, her voice low. "I heard about the guards at your place. Come in before someone notices." She stepped aside, and he entered a space that was both clinic and living quarters. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, their fragrances mingling into a complex tapestry of scents. Shelves lined the walls, filled with labeled jars and tinctures. A small herb gacha machine stood in one corner, its mechanisms worn but functional. In the center of the room, a sturdy table served as both examination surface and workspace. Alara bolted the door behind him. "They've been watching me too," she said without preamble, gesturing toward the window. Through the slightly parted shutters, Leo could see the distant figure of a town guard leaning against a building across the street. "Not as openly as your place, but enough to make my patients nervous. Baron Vex doesn't like anyone operating outside his monopoly network." Leo set the wrapped hammer on the table. The cloth fell away slightly, revealing the divine metal that seemed to drink the light from the room. Alara's eyes flicked to it, then back to his face. "Is that what they're calling the cursed artifact?" "It's not cursed," Leo said, his voice weary. He'd been repeating this to himself for days. "It's complicated." He spent the next hour explaining everything, the 10,000 failures, the guaranteed ultimate pity, the hammer's appearance, the spite or dagger, and his current goal of accumulating another 10,000 failures for the next pity drop. As he spoke, Alara listened without interruption, her expression shifting from skepticism to dawning understanding. When he finished, she walked to her herb gacha machine and ran a hand over its worn controls. "So every failure brings you closer to something that can break their system," she said quietly. "And they know it. That's why they're watching you. That's why they stole your tools and left that note." Leo nodded. "I need to keep pulling, but I can't do it openly anymore. The guards at my workshop would report every coin I spend on gacha. And if I travel to the villages again, they'll follow me." Alara turned from the machine, her gaze steady. "You can use mine. The herb gacha. I have a monthly allowance from the town for medical supplies, but most of what comes out is useless, withered roots, moldy leaves. I've been failing pulls for years just to get the occasional useful herb." She opened a ledger on her table, its pages filled with neat columns of dates and results. Look. Last month, 147 pulls, 12 successful medicinal herbs, 135 failures. The month before, 163 pulls, 9 successes. They charge me premium rates because I'm a commercial user, but most of what I get is garbage. Leo felt a strange surge of hope. You'd let me use your allowance. In exchange for something, Elara said, her practical nature surfacing. She gestured around the clinic. Look at my tools. My scalpels are dull, my forceps bend under pressure, my bone saws can barely cut through chicken bones. I've been trying to get proper surgical instruments through the tool gacha for months, but all I get are rusted nails and broken pliers. If your hammer can make ordinary steel into something better. It can, Leo said immediately. The minor crafting boost, it's not just for divine materials. It enhances whatever I work on. I could take common steel and make instruments that would last you years. Elara studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against the risk. Outside, the guard shifted position, his shadow stretching across the street. Finally, she nodded. Then we have a deal. You can use my herb gacha for your failures. I'll even help you pull, 2 sets of hands will make it faster. And you'll make me a full set of surgical tools. They began that same day. Elara cleared space near the gacha machine, moving jars of dried comfrey and willow bark to make room. The machine itself was an older model, its brass fittings tarnished, its pull lever stiff with disuse. Each pull cost 3 copper coins, a rate that made Leo wince, knowing how quickly it would drain resources if paid from his own pocket. Don't worry about the cost, Elara said as she fed the first coins into the slot. The town covers it as part of my clinic funding. Baron Vex's people audit it quarterly, but they only care about the total spent, not what comes out. She pulled the lever. The machine whirred, gears grinding with a sound like grinding teeth. A moment later, a small compartment opened, revealing a handful of brown, shriveled leaves that smelled faintly of rot. Failure. Leo recorded it in his own ledger, the number 10,306 appearing in neat script. He'd brought the book with him, its pages now filled with columns of numbers from his travels. Each failure was a step closer, but looking at the total, 10,305 before today, he felt the enormity of the task. He needed 9,695 more. At this rate, even with Elara's help. Stop thinking about the total, Elara said, as if reading his thoughts. She fed more coins into the machine. Just focus on this pull. Then the next one. They developed a rhythm. Elara would load coins and pull the lever. Leo would record the result, then take his turn while she prepared the next batch of coins. Most pulls yielded worthless herbs, moldy mint, brittle lavender stems, rosemary that crumbled to dust at the touch. Occasionally, something useful would appear, a bundle of fresh yarrow, a sprig of vibrant chamomile. Elara would set these aside with careful hands, her expression softening briefly before returning to its determined set. As they worked, they talked. Elara spoke of her clinic, of patients who couldn't afford proper medicine because the healing potion gacha was controlled by Baron Vex's syndicate. She told him about children with fevers whose parents had spent their last coins on failed pulls, about farmers with broken bones who couldn't work because bone-setting kits were locked behind premium gacha tiers. The system is designed to keep us desperate, she said, her voice tight with anger. She pulled the lever again. Another failure, a cluster of blackened time. If you have money, you can buy success. If you don't, you're left with scraps. And even when you do get something good, the taxes and licensing fees take most of its value. Leo listened, his own resentment finding echo in hers. He told her about his workshop's bankruptcy, about the 10,000 failures that had made him a town joke, about the loan sharks and their demands. He didn't mention the depth of his loneliness, how for years, the only conversations he'd had were transactional, customers demanding items, collectors demanding payment, merchants offering pity prices for his work. By the end of the first day, they'd recorded 87 failures. Leo's hands ached from writing, his eyes strained from watching the gacha machine's repetitive motions. But there was a satisfaction in the work, in the steady climb of numbers. And there was something else, a companionship he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The next morning, Leo began work on the surgical tools. Elara had provided him with bars of common steel, nothing special, just standard stock she'd acquired through trade. He set up a temporary forge in her back courtyard, using stones to build a fire pit and borrowing bellows from a sympathetic neighbor. The divine hammer felt different in this space, surrounded by growing things rather than metal and smoke. Its weight was comforting, familiar. He started with a scalpel. The process was simple: heat the steel, shape it on an anvil borrowed from the blacksmith down the street, then use the hammer's boost during the final quenching. But as he worked, something unexpected happened. The hammer seemed to respond to the purpose of the tool, to heal rather than harm. When he struck the glowing steel, the metal didn't just take shape, it seemed to align at a molecular level, the grain becoming impossibly fine and uniform. Elara watched from the doorway, her arms crossed. When Leo handed her the finished scalpel, she tested its edge against a piece of parchment. The blade passed through without resistance, leaving a clean cut that didn't even curl the paper. "Gods above," she whispered, turning the tool in the light. The steel had taken on a faint sheen, like oil on water. "I've never held anything this precise." Over the next 3 days, they settled into a routine. Mornings were for gacha pulls, 2 hours of steady, monotonous failure. Afternoons were for forging. Leo created forceps with teeth that interlocked perfectly, bone saws with blades that remained sharp through test cuts on beef bones, retractors that moved with smooth, silent precision. Each tool carried the same subtle enhancement, the same impossible quality that marked them as more than ordinary steel. Elara began using them immediately. On the 3rd day, she treated a woodcutter with a deep gash in his leg. Afterward, she came to the courtyard where Leo was quenching a set of clamps. "The scalpel cut through necrotic tissue like it was butter," she said, her voice filled with something like awe. "And the forceps, I could grip the smallest blood vessel without crushing it." The man didn't even need a healing potion. Basic stitching was enough. Their collaboration didn't go unnoticed. On the 4th day, while Leo was recording their morning's failures, bringing the total to 10,593, a customer came to the clinic, a woman with a cough. She watched them at the gacha machine, her eyes lingering on the ledger, on the piles of failed herbs they hadn't yet disposed of. "You're pulling a lot today," the woman remarked as Elara examined her. "Stocking up for winter," Elara said smoothly, but her eyes met Leo's with unease. After the patient left, Elara bolted the door. "We need to be more careful. People talk. And if word gets back to Vex people that we're doing mass pulls." They started working at night, covering the windows with thick cloth to hide the light from their lantern. The gacha machine's whirring seemed louder in the darkness, each failure echoing in the quiet clinic. But the numbers climbed: 10,687, 10,722, 10,801. On the 7th day, they reached a milestone: 300 additional failures since Leo's arrival. His ledger now showed 10,605 total. They celebrated quietly, with a simple meal of bread and stew that Elara prepared. For the first time in weeks, Leo felt a sense of momentum. The goal of 20,000 failures still loomed large, but now it felt achievable. He had an ally. He had a safe place to work. He had a plan. "To small victories," Elara said, raising her cup of herbal tea. Leo clinked his own cup against hers. "To breaking their system." They were clearing the dishes when the first pound came at the door, not a knock, but a heavy, authoritative thud that shook the frame. Then another. And another. "Open in the name of Baron Vex," a voice shouted from outside. Elara froze, a plate slipping from her fingers to shatter on the floor. Through the shuttered windows, they could see torchlight moving, shadows of multiple figures crowding the entrance. Another pound, harder this time. Wood splintered around the bolt. "We know you're in there. Open now or we break it down." Leo's eyes went to the gacha machine, to his ledger lying open on the table, to the divine hammer wrapped in its cloth. Elara met his gaze, her face pale but determined. She motioned toward the back door, but even as she did, they heard footsteps circling the building, cutting off their escape. The front door shuddered under another impact. The bolt groaned, its metal bending. "Elara of Stonebridge Clinic," the voice roared. "You are charged with illegal gacha manipulation and conspiracy to undermine the regional economy. Open this door immediately." Then the door exploded inward, splinters flying as the bolt gave way. Torchlight flooded the clinic, revealing 6 of Baron Vex's guards in full armor, their weapons drawn. In the lead was a man Leo recognized, one of the guards who had been watching his workshop. His eyes swept the room, taking in the gacha machine, the piles of failed herbs, the ledger, the wrapped hammer on the table. A cruel smile spread across his face. "Well now," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "What do we have here?" The clinic door splintered inward with a crash that shook the shelves of dried herbs. Ilara's glass vials rattled like angry teeth as 4 of Baron Vex's guards stormed through the doorway, their polished breastplates gleaming in the afternoon light filtering through the high windows. Leo's hand tightened around the divine hammer at his belt, its cool metal surface humming with a faint energy only he could feel. "Ilara of the Herbalist's Guild," boomed the lead guard, a broad-shouldered man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. "You stand accused of illegal gacha manipulation and conspiracy against the Baron's monopoly." Ilara stepped forward, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "This is a clinic," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "We've been pulling herb gacha for medical supplies, as is our right under guild charter." "Your charter doesn't cover hiding known criminals," the scarred guard snapped, his eyes locking onto Leo. "The blacksmith with the cursed artifact. Baron Vex wants words with both of you." Chaos erupted as 2 guards moved to seize Ilara. She struggled, knocking over a table of surgical instruments, the very tools Leo had forged for her just days before. The metallic clatter filled the room as scalpels and forceps scattered across the stone floor. Another guard lunged for Leo, but he sidestepped, his mind racing faster than his feet could move. The herb gacha machine stood in a corner, its wooden frame carved with healing sigils. Ilara's daily ritual: pull the lever, receive random herbs for her patients. Leo's eyes darted between the advancing guard and the machine. His failure counter sat at 10,605. He'd been meticulously tracking every pull in his ledger, the numbers burning in his memory. 500 more failures until the next pity drop. But the guards were here now, and the system demanded its due. "Don't touch her!" Leo shouted, buying himself half a second. He dove for the gacha machine, his shoulder connecting painfully with the guard's armored side as he passed. The man grunted, momentarily thrown off balance. Leo's fingers found the lever. It was cool to the touch, worn smooth by countless hands seeking healing. He thought of the 10,000 failures that had broken him, the bankruptcy, the laughter, the divine hammer that had been his salvation and his curse. He thought of the ledger in his pocket, each entry a monument to his legendary bad luck. And he pulled. The machine whirred, gears grinding with a sound like grinding bones. A flash of light, not the usual soft glow of herb identification, but a violent, searing white that filled the clinic. The guards stumbled back, shielding their eyes. Ilara gasped. Leo felt the familiar sensation, the system buckling under statistical impossibility, reality itself protesting the violation of its rules. Then silence. The machine dispensed not a bundle of common herbs, but a single feather. It drifted downward, catching the light in impossible ways, shimmering with hues of crimson, gold, and deepest orange, as if containing captured sunset within its veins. It landed softly in Leo's outstretched palm, radiating warmth that spread up his arm like liquid sunlight. "What in the 9 hells?" muttered the scarred guard, lowering his sword arm. Ilara's eyes widened. That can't be. A phoenix feather? They're myth. Legends say they vanished centuries ago." Leo stared at the feather. Knowledge flooded his mind, not through words, but through the hammer's connection to his thoughts. The phoenix feather, legendary alchemical material. Capable of reviving the dead when properly prepared. Required immediate stabilization or its power would dissipate. His blacksmith's instincts screamed at him: craft, forge, create. "Ilara," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Your strongest preservation herbs. Now." Before she could respond, one of the younger guards, overeager and frightened by the unnatural light, lunged at Leo with his short sword. The scarred captain shouted, "Hold," but it was too late. Leo twisted, the feather still clutched in his left hand, his right bringing up the divine hammer in a defensive arc. Metal met metal with a deafening clang that reverberated through the small clinic. The guard's sword shattered. Not merely broke, shattered into a dozen pieces that flew in all directions. One shard caught the young guard in the thigh, slicing through leather and flesh. He cried out, collapsing to the floor as blood began pooling around him. Medic, shouted another guard, his training overriding his fear of the supernatural. Elara was already moving, grabbing her kit. But the wound was deep, arterial. Her hands worked frantically, applying pressure, but the blood kept coming. I need more than bandages, she said, her voice tight with professional panic. He'll bleed out in minutes. Leo looked from the dying guard to the phoenix feather in his hand. The warmth pulsed, almost like a heartbeat. The feather, he said. We can use it. It's raw power, Elara protested even as she continued trying to stem the bleeding. Without proper preparation. We don't have time for proper, Leo interrupted. He knelt beside her, the divine hammer in one hand, the feather in the other. Tell me what herbs to mix it with. The hammer, it's showing me possibilities. Elara's eyes met his, and he saw the moment her healer's instincts overcame her caution. Golden root for stabilization. Silverleaf for conductivity. And my last vial of moonwell water for binding. She scrambled to her feet, nearly tripping over scattered surgical tools. Leo watched as she pulled ingredients from shelves with practiced efficiency. The other guards stood frozen, weapons half raised, caught between duty and the surreal scene unfolding before them. Captain, one asked uncertainly. The scarred guard watched Leo, his expression unreadable. Stand down, he said finally. If the blacksmith can save Joran, stand down. Elara returned with the ingredients. Leo placed the phoenix feather on the stone floor, then raised the divine hammer. As he brought it down, he didn't strike with force, but with precision, a gentle tap that nonetheless resonated with power. The feather glowed brighter, its veins separating into strands of light that wove together with the crushed herbs and moonwell water Elara poured over it. The mixture began to bubble and steam, emitting a scent like rain on sun-warmed stone and blooming flowers. Colors swirled within it, the crimson of the feather, the gold of the root, the silver of the leaf, all merging into a liquid that seemed to contain its own inner light. Now, Leo said, stepping back. Elara didn't hesitate. She poured the glowing liquid over the guard's wound. The effect was immediate and miraculous. The bleeding stopped as if commanded. Flesh knit together before their eyes, leaving only a pale scar where a fatal injury had been moments before. The young guard, Joran, gasped, his eyes flying open as color returned to his face. Silence filled the clinic, broken only by Joran's ragged breathing. The other guards stared, their weapons now completely lowered. The scarred captain approached slowly, his eyes fixed on the now empty spot where the phoenix feather had been. That was. He began, then shook his head as if clearing it. Baron Vex will hear of this. Tell him what you saw, Leo said, meeting the captain's gaze. Tell him the blacksmith with the cursed artifact just saved one of his men's lives with a feather from a myth. The captain studied him for a long moment, then nodded curtly. We'll withdraw. For now. But this isn't over, blacksmith. The Baron doesn't forget. As the guards helped Joran to his feet and filed out of the ruined clinic door, Leo felt the familiar reset, the counter in his mind clicking back to 0. 10,606 failures, culminating in a single feather that had just changed everything. Again. Elara slumped against her worktable, her hands trembling. They'll be back, she whispered. With more men. With mages, maybe. We need to go, Leo said, already gathering what little they could carry. His ledger went into his pocket. The divine hammer at his belt. Somewhere they won't think to look. There's a cave, Elara said after a moment's thought. West of here, in the Whispering Hills. I used to gather rare mushrooms there. It's hidden, difficult to find unless you know the path. They left as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, taking back alleys and forgotten paths out of Stonebridge. Leo kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see Vex guards or Silas's agents at every turn. But the town faded behind them, replaced by rolling hills dotted with twisted trees that seemed to lean away from the prevailing wind. The cave entrance was exactly as Elara had described, hidden behind a waterfall that cascaded down mossy rocks. The sound of falling water masked their movements as they slipped inside. The interior was larger than Leo expected, with a high ceiling and dry stone floor. Faint bioluminescent fungi provided just enough light to see by, casting everything in an eerie blue glow. Leo built a small fire from deadwood he found just outside the entrance, careful to keep the smoke minimal. As the flames crackled to life, He took out his ledger and opened it to a fresh page. What now? Elara asked, wrapping her cloak tighter around herself. The cave was cool, but not unpleasantly so. Now I plan, Leo said, his eyes fixed on the empty page. The phoenix feather is gone, but its power. I felt it. When I was crafting that potion, the hammer showed me something. A sword. Not just any sword, one that could channel that kind of resurrection energy. He began sketching, his charcoal moving with a certainty that surprised even him. The design flowed from memory that wasn't entirely his own, the divine hammer whispering possibilities into his mind. A blade that could heal as well as harm. A weapon that could turn the very concept of violence on its head. You'd need another pity drop for the materials, Elara said quietly. 10,000 more failures. Leo nodded, still sketching. I know. But think about it, a sword that can undo what it does. That could change everything. Not just the market, but everything. He was so absorbed in his planning that he almost didn't hear it. The crunch of gravel underfoot. Not from inside the cave, but from outside, beyond the waterfall's curtain. Leo froze, his charcoal stopping mid-stroke. Elara's eyes met his, wide with sudden fear. Another footstep. Then another. Too deliberate to be an animal. Too close to be coincidence. Leo slowly closed his ledger, his hand moving to the divine hammer at his belt. The fire cast dancing shadows on the cave walls, but beyond the waterfall sound, he could now make out voices, low, professional, methodical. Tracks lead here. One voice said, barely audible over the water. Vex pays triple for the hammer. Another responded. Bounty hunters. Hired by Baron Vex. And they'd found the cave. The cave entrance shuddered under another impact, dust and pebbles raining down from the low ceiling. Leo braced his shoulder against the makeshift barricade, a heavy slab of limestone they dragged from deeper in the cavern, as Elara pressed her ear to a crack in the rock. Outside, voices echoed with a cruel, mocking edge. Come on out, Blacksmith. Baron Vex pays well for your head, but will settle for that shiny hammer of yours. Leo recognized the voice as belonging to one of the bounty hunters who tracked them to the Whispering Hills. His breath came in ragged gasps, the damp chill of the cave seeping into his bones. The air smelled of wet stone and the faint, lingering scent of herbs from Elara's satchel. In the dim light filtering through narrow fissures overhead, he could see her face pale but determined, her fingers tightening around a pouch of dried leaves. They're trying to pry the barricade loose, Elara whispered, her voice barely audible over the scraping of metal on stone from outside. 3 of them, maybe 4. I caught a glimpse of leather armor and crossbows. Leo's mind raced. The cave was a cramped, natural hollow they'd stumbled upon during their frantic escape, its walls rough-hewn and glistening with moisture. His divine hammer lay on a flat rock beside a small pile of scrap metal he'd scavenged from abandoned mining tools in the hills, rusted iron bars, a broken plowshare, and a few copper fittings. The phoenix feather, a slender, iridescent quill that had materialized during his last pity drop, rested in a leather wrap next to it, its faint warmth palpable even through the cloth. He'd planned to use it for a grand project, but survival demanded improvisation. Another thud shook the barricade, and a splinter of wood flew inward. Leo gritted his teeth. He couldn't fight them head-on, not with his basic blacksmithing skills and no combat training. But the hammer in his hand hummed with a subtle energy, the minor crafting boost it granted tingling up his arm. It was a tool for creation, not destruction, yet in this world of gacha-driven scarcity, a masterpiece might be weapon enough. Elara, I need to forge something now, Leo said, his voice low and urgent. He knelt by the scrap pile, his fingers tracing the cold metal. It'll take everything I have. Can you buy me time? Elara nodded, her eyes sharp. I have herbs that can produce thick smoke when burned. It'll disorient them, maybe make them think we've set a trap. She began rummaging through her bag, pulling out bundles of dried sage and nightshade. But it won't hold them long. They're professionals. Leo didn't waste words. He lifted the divine hammer, its weight familiar and comforting, and placed the phoenix feather atop the largest iron bar. The feather glowed softly, its colors shifting from gold to crimson in the cave's gloom. As he brought the hammer down, a spark of divine energy flared, fusing the feather into the metal with a hiss like steam. The process was grueling, Each strike drained his stamina, leaving him sweating and lightheaded. His muscles ached from days of travel and tension, but he pushed through, focusing on the image of a blade born from his accumulated misfortune. Outside, the hunter's taunts grew more insistent. "Smell that? Herbalist's tricks. Burn them out." Elara moved to the cave entrance, her movements swift and silent. She lit a small fire using flint and tinder, then tossed her herb mixtures into the flames. Thick, acrid smoke billowed out, seeping through the gaps in the barricade. Coughs and curses erupted from beyond, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. "It's working, but they'll regroup," Elara called back, her voice strained from the smoke. Leo hammered on, the metal beginning to take shape under his blows. The scrap iron softened and flowed, guided by the hammer's boost, as if remembering its purpose. He shaped a long, slightly curved blade, its edge forming with unnatural sharpness. Sweat dripped from his brow, sizzling as it hit the hot metal. With each strike, he poured his frustration into the forge, the 10,000 failures, the bankruptcy, the relentless pursuit by Baron Vex's lackeys. This sword would be a testament to all of it. As the blade neared completion, it began to glow with a fiery aura, heat radiating in waves that warmed the cave's chill air. The light cast dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating Elara's worried expression as she kept watch. Leo quenched the sword in a pool of collected rainwater, steam erupting with a roar that echoed through the cavern. When he lifted it, the blade shone with a deep, molten hue, its surface etched with faint patterns like embers in a dying fire. He named it silently, Ember's Promise. Just then, a final, brutal impact shattered the barricade. The limestone slab cracked and toppled inward, revealing 3 bounty hunters in the entrance, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, a lean woman wielding a crossbow, and a younger one with a nervous grip on a dagger. They blinked in the sudden light from the sword, their eyes widening. "What in the hells is that?" the scarred man growled, taking a step back. Leo stood, hefting Ember's Promise. The sword felt alive in his hands, its heat not burning him but pulsing with a protective energy. He didn't swing it, he simply held it aloft. The aura intensified, waves of scorching air billowing outward. The hunters recoiled, their leather armor smoking at the edges. "Back off," Leo said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "This isn't a fight you want." The woman lowered her crossbow, her face pale. That's mythic grade. Vex didn't say anything about this." Without another word, they retreated, scrambling up the rocky slope outside. Their footsteps faded into the distance, leaving only the crackle of the sword's energy and the heavy silence of the cave. Leo slumped against the wall, Ember's Promise cooling slightly in his grip. Elara rushed to his side, checking him for injuries. "You did it," she breathed, her eyes on the blade. "But they'll tell Vex. He'll send more, or come himself." Nodding, Leo examined the sword. Its quality was undeniable, a masterpiece that could disrupt markets, maybe even challenge the gacha economy's stranglehold. But selling it would draw attention like a beacon, and they were fugitives with a reset failure counter of 0. He needed to plan, to build alliances, to navigate this new threat. As they gathered their few belongings, a faint rustle came from the cave entrance. A small, rolled parchment lay on the ground, tied with a silk ribbon. Leo picked it up, his fingers tracing the wax seal, a stylized coin and scale, the symbol of the Merchants Guild. Unrolling it, he read the elegant script, "Your craftsmanship has not gone unnoticed. The guild offers protection from Baron Vex and his ilk. In return, deliver the sword to our agent in Stonebridge by dawn. Do not disappoint. A friend in commerce." Leo handed the note to Elara, his mind racing. The Merchants Guild, powerful, enigmatic, and far-reaching. Was this an opportunity or a trap? He stared at Ember's Promise, its ember-like glow reflecting in his eyes, as the weight of the decision settled over the cave like a shroud. The tavern smelled of stale ale and damp wood, a place called the Rusty Anvil that Leo had chosen precisely because no one would expect a fugitive blacksmith there. He sat in a shadowed corner, the worn oak table between him and the woman who called herself Lysandra. Ember's Promise rested in a leather-wrapped bundle at his feet, its faint fiery aura making the air around it shimmer like heat haze on a summer road. Lysandra was all sharp angles and calculated poise. Her merchant's robes were simple but of fine weave, dark green with silver thread tracing the Merchants Guild symbol, a balanced scale over an open ledger. She studied him with eyes that missed nothing, from the calluses on his hands to the tension in his shoulders. "They say you turned a guard's certain death into a miraculous recovery," she began, her voice low and measured. "They say you forged a weapon in a cave that made professional hunters flee without drawing steel." Leo kept his expression neutral. "They say many things in taverns. The guild verifies before it invests." She leaned forward slightly. "We have sources in Vex's guard. Joran's recovery was, medically impossible. The hunter's reports described a sword that burned without fuel. He didn't confirm or deny. Instead, he asked, what does the guild want? Stability, she said simply. Vex's monopoly on regional gacha sales strangles trade. He inflates prices, restricts access, and pockets the difference while commoners starve. Your creations introduce variables. Unpredictable variables disrupt monopolies." Leo's fingers traced the grain of the table. He remembered the loan sharks at his door, the empty workshop, the 10,000 failures that broke him. "And your offer?" "Protection," Lysandra said. "A forge in the guild district, warded against unauthorized entry. Legal standing as a guild-affiliated artisan. In return, you supply exclusive items through our channels. Not everything, just enough to create alternative markets. We'll handle distribution, pricing, and diplomatic incidents." He considered the weight of Ember's promise at his feet. The sword felt alive somehow, a constant low hum against his senses. "Vex won't accept competition." "He'll have to," she replied, a flicker of steel in her voice. "The guild has resources he cannot match. But we need leverage. Your craftsmanship is that leverage." Leo thought of Elara, waiting in their temporary safe house. Thought of the surgical tools he'd forged for her, the way her hands had steadied when using them. Thought of the phoenix feather dissolving into golden light as it healed a man who'd come to arrest them. "I set the pace," he said finally. "No quotas. No deadlines. I craft when I have materials worth crafting, and I won't be rushed into another cave forging." Lysandra's lips curved in what might have been approval. "Reasonable. We'll provide access to our high-volume gacha machines. The ones merchants use for bulk material acquisition. You can accumulate failures efficiently." He almost laughed at the clinical way she said it. As if failing 10,000 times was just another business transaction. But she was right, the divine hammer required the failures, and the guild's machines could deliver them faster than pulling herb packets one by one. They spent the next hour negotiating details. Leo would receive a monthly stipend for living expenses. The guild would handle any legal challenges from Vex. In return, Leo would provide at least one disruptive item per quarter, something that would force market adjustments. He insisted on keeping Ember's promise for now, and Lysandra agreed, though her eyes lingered on the bundle. When they parted, she handed him a brass key. "The forge is in the artisan's quarter. Third building from the western gate. It's modest, but warded. Your herbalist friend can stay in the attached quarters." Leo took the key. It felt heavier than it should. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. The guild district was cleaner than the rest of town, the streets paved with smooth stones instead of packed dirt. Leo's new forge stood between a glassblower's workshop and a tailor's shop, its stone walls marked with faintly glowing runes that pulsed when he approached. The wards recognized the key and shimmered green as he entered. Inside was a single large room with a proper forge, anvil, and tool racks. Not as large as his old workshop, but better maintained. The air smelled of clean stone and old smoke. Elara was already there, unpacking her medical supplies onto a shelf she'd claimed. "They gave us 2 rooms upstairs," she said without looking up. "And a kitchen. It's suspiciously generous." "They want something worth more than rent," Leo replied, setting Ember's promise on the anvil. The sword's aura brightened momentarily, as if recognizing its birthplace. Over the next 3 days, Leo visited the guild's gacha hall, a cavernous building filled with whirring machines that dispensed materials in exchange for coin. Lysandra had arranged access to the industrial-grade pullers, machines designed for merchants buying in bulk. Each pull cost 5 times what a common street gacha cost, but delivered 20 times the volume. Leo stood before Machine 7 on the morning of the 4th day. It was a hulking thing of brass and polished wood, with a hopper that could accept entire sacks of coin. A guild attendant, a young man named Corin with ink-stained fingers, showed him the controls. Standard or mix, Corin explained. Iron, copper, tin, with trace chances for silver or mithril. The failure rate is 98% for anything above common grade. Most merchants use it for bulk iron production. Perfect. Leo began pulling. The machine clanked and whirred, disgorging piles of common ore into collection bins. Iron nuggets, copper flakes, tin shavings. Nothing of value. Nothing that would trigger anything but another failure. He pulled for hours. The rhythmic clank-clank thud of the machine became a meditation. Each pull brought him closer to 10,000 again. Each failure was a step toward the next pity drop, the next divine material, the next item that would shake Vex's monopoly. By the end of the week, his failure counter had climbed to 1,842. The forge's storage room was filled with bins of common ore, enough iron to supply a small army, all worthless for his purposes but valuable to the guild's economy. Lysandra visited periodically, checking his progress, her expression unreadable. The rumors are starting, she said on the 7th day, watching him sort through another bin of iron nuggets. Word of your dagger sale to Orin has resurfaced. The spite ore story is being told in every tavern. Now they're whispering about a sword that heals and burns. Leo didn't look up. And material prices are fluctuating, she said. Common ores have dropped 5% because merchants are anticipating something. Herbal prices are up because Alara's clinic was known for quality. Vex has responded by raising gacha costs across his controlled districts. A basic bread pull now costs half a day's wages for a laborer. He finally met her eyes. People are suffering because of rumors. Because of anticipation, she corrected. The market fears what you might create next. Fear creates volatility. Vex is exploiting that volatility to squeeze more profit before any real disruption occurs. That night, Leo lay awake in his narrow bed, listening to the distant sounds of the city. He thought of Harl, the farmer in Greenroot village who'd shared his meager supper without asking for payment. Thought of Lyra, the mill overseer who'd lowered her gacha rates after he fixed her water wheel. Common people, just trying to survive in a system designed to bleed them dry. And now his mere presence was making it worse. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. 2 weeks passed. Leo's failure counter reached 4,917. The forge had settled into a rhythm, mornings spent pulling at the guild hall, afternoons sorting and storing materials, evenings planning his next project with Alara. She'd set up a small clinic in the front room, treating guild members and their families in exchange for herbs and goodwill. It was during one of these evening sessions that Lysandra arrived unannounced, her usual composure frayed at the edges. Vex is moving, she said without preamble, closing the door behind her. He's pulled guards from 3 outlying villages. Hired additional mercenaries. Our sources say he's amassing forces at his estate. Alara set down the herb she was grinding. For what? A raid, Lysandra said, her eyes on Leo. On this forge. He knows he can't touch you in the guild district legally, so he's preparing to do it illegally. Claim you violated some obscure ordinance, that the wards failed, that it was a tragic accident. Leo felt the familiar cold weight in his stomach. The same feeling he'd had when the lone sharks surrounded his old workshop. The same feeling when Vex guards stormed Alara's clinic. When? 3 days, she said. Maybe 4. He's waiting for a shipment of alchemical supplies, something to counter our wards. Once he has those. She didn't need to finish. Leo looked around the forge, at the tools hanging neatly on their racks, at the forge glowing with banked coals, at Ember's promise resting in its stand by the anvil. This place was supposed to be safe. A fresh start. But the world didn't allow fresh starts for people like him. What do we do? Alara asked, her voice tight. Lysandra's expression was grim. The guild will reinforce the wards. Double the guard patrols. But if Vex is bringing alchemical counters, wards can be broken. Guards can be bribed or overwhelmed. She met Leo's eyes, and in that moment, he saw the calculation behind hers. The guild's protection had limits. Their alliance was valuable, but not worth a war with a noble, not unless he gave them something worth fighting for. Finish your counter, she said quietly. Whatever you're building toward with those failures, finish it before he arrives. Give us something undeniable. Something that makes protecting you not just profitable, but necessary. After she left, Leo stood at the forge window, watching the lanterns flicker to life in the guild district. The safe, orderly streets suddenly felt like a gilded cage. Ember's promise hummed softly behind him, its fiery aura casting dancing shadows on the wall. He had 5,083 failures to go. 3 days to accumulate them. 3 days to reach the pity drop, obtain a divine material, and craft something that would change the calculus. Outside, a merchant's cart rattled past, loaded with goods bought through gacha pulls. Somewhere in the city, a family was deciding whether to spend their last coins on bread or medicine, both locked behind Vex's inflated prices. Leo turned from the window and walked to the anvil. He picked up his divine hammer, feeling its familiar weight, the subtle warmth that always seemed to emanate from it. The hammer of a forgotten god, earned through 10,000 failures. Now he needed 10,000 more. And he had 3 days. The economic warfare wasn't coming. It was already here. And he was standing at its forge, hammer in hand, with a city holding its breath. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal echoed through the warded forge, each strike precise and measured. Leo wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a dark smear across his forehead. The guild-safe workshop was larger than his old one, 3 times the size, with reinforced stone walls that hummed with protective enchantments. But it still felt like a cage. He examined the reinforced door he'd been working on for the past 6 hours. Thick iron bands crossed oak planks, each joint sealed with molten metal. The divine hammer in his hand felt lighter than it should, its weight distributed perfectly for his grip. The minor crafting boost it granted wasn't dramatic, just enough to make metal flow more easily under his touch, to let him see stress points before they became weaknesses. He'd used it to weave thin strands of steel through the door's core, creating a lattice that would shatter blades rather than splinter. 4,917, he muttered to himself, the number etched into his mind like a brand. That's how many failures he'd accumulated since striking the deal with Lysandra. The guild's industrial gacha machines had been a revelation, massive contraptions that could process 100 pulls an hour, spitting out worthless pebbles and rusted scraps with mechanical efficiency. He'd spent days feeding them, watching his counter climb while his hands worked on other things. Now it stood at 8,943. The numbers ticked up in his head with every pull, a grim tally that had once meant despair but now represented power waiting to be unleashed. Elara moved through the forge's side chamber, her movements economical as she sorted dried herbs into clay pots. The scent of earth and green things cut through the metallic tang of the workshop. She'd converted part of the space into an alchemical station, using guild-provided supplies to brew stamina recovery potions. Each batch cost her precious herb stocks, moonleaf and sunroot she'd been saving for emergencies. These should last us 3 days, she said without looking up, her voice carrying over the hiss of Leo's quenching bucket. If we ration them. The guild's protection doesn't include unlimited supplies. Leo nodded, dipping the newly forged door hinges into the water. Steam billowed up, obscuring his view for a moment. Vex won't wait 3 days. Lysandra said 3 to 4, that means he's coming tomorrow or the day after. He set the hinges aside to cool and moved to the gacha machine in the corner. It was smaller than the industrial models, a personal unit Corrin had provided, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. Leo fed it a copper coin, the last of a stack Lysandra had given him. The machine whirred, gears grinding as it processed the pull. A moment later, it spat out a lump of dull gray or no larger than his thumbnail. Failure number 8,944. He picked up the ore, turning it over in his palm. Common iron, impure and brittle. Worthless for anything but practice. He tossed it into a growing pile near the forge's entrance, a mound of failed pulls that had become a strange sort of monument. Sometimes he imagined what it would look like to an outsider, a master blacksmith surrounded by garbage, deliberately seeking out the worst materials the system could offer. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years, his bad luck had been a curse, something that broke him down piece by piece until only spite remained. Now it was a weapon. Every failed pull brought him closer to that moment when the system would break, when guaranteed ultimate pity would force a divine material into his hands. He just had to survive long enough to reach it. Over the next hours, he worked on trap mechanisms. Simple things at first, pressure plates that would release nets, tripwires connected to bells. Then more complex devices, spring-loaded blades concealed in floorboards, channels in the walls that would funnel smoke from burning herbs into specific areas. He used common or for all of it, the divine hammer's subtle boost letting him work imperfections into advantages. A slightly uneven spring would release at an unpredictable angle. A poorly balanced blade would swing wider than expected. Ilara watched him set one such trap near the forge's rear entrance. "You're not trying to kill them," she observed. "No," Leo said, adjusting the tension on a wire. "Killing Vex's men would make us murderers. The guild's protection has limits. But incapacitating them? That's self-defense." He moved to his workbench, where he'd laid out materials for his main project, arrows. Not ordinary arrows, but something he'd conceptualized during the long nights in the cave. He called them luck-bane arrows in his mind, though he hadn't spoken the name aloud. Each shaft was made from common oak, fletched with goose feathers the guild had provided. The heads were where his work mattered. Using the pile of failed ore, he forged arrowheads that looked crude and unbalanced. But under the divine hammer's influence, he'd worked the metal so that each imperfection served a purpose. A slight curve to the blade would make it rotate unpredictably in flight, defeating standard armor by striking at angles plates weren't designed to protect. Tiny barbs near the tip would catch on cloth and leather, making removal painful but not fatal. The weight distribution was deliberately off, just enough to make the arrows drop faster than expected, forcing attackers to misjudge their range. He worked through the afternoon, the forge's heat becoming a constant presence. Sweat soaked his tunic, drying in salty patches only to be renewed with each movement. Ilara brought him one of her stamina potions, a murky green liquid in a clay cup. He drank it in one gulp, grimacing at the bitter aftertaste. Almost immediately, a warmth spread through his limbs, easing the ache in his shoulders and clearing the fog from his mind. "How many failures now?" Ilara asked as he returned to the gacha machine. 9,211, Leo said, feeding another coin into the slot. The machine processed it with the same indifferent whir, producing another worthless stone. He added it to the pile. 789 to go. Outside, guild guards patrolled the perimeter. Leo could hear their footsteps through the thick walls, the occasional murmur of conversation. Corin had assigned 6 men to the forge, all veterans of market disputes and protection details. They moved with professional efficiency, but Leo could sense their tension. They knew what was coming. As evening fell, Lysandra arrived with fresh supplies and a warning. She wore practical leathers instead of her usual merchant's robes, a short sword at her hip. "Vex's forces have been spotted gathering at his estate," she said without preamble. "At least 30 men, plus whatever enforcers he's hired. They're moving alchemical supplies, smoke pellets, acid vials, ward breakers." Leo set down the arrow he'd been fletching. "When?" "Tomorrow night, most likely. Dawn the day after at the latest." Lysandra's eyes scanned the forge, taking in the defensive preparations. "The guild's wards will hold against direct assault, but sustained pressure will wear them down. And if they bring a proper siege engine?" "They won't," Ilara said from her workstation. "Not in the guild district. The other merchants would revolt." "Vex is desperate," Lysandra countered. "Your dagger started this, Leo. The sword you forged in a cave made it worse. Now rumors are spreading about what you're building here. Material prices are fluctuating wildly. Common ore has tripled in cost since last week because people think you found a way to make it valuable. Vex's monopoly is crumbling, and he'll do anything to stop it." Leo returned to his work, his hands moving automatically as he processed the information. 9,305 failures. 9,306. Each pull brought him closer, but also used up resources. The guild's copper supply wasn't infinite, and every coin spent on failed pulls was one not spent on food or materials. He finished the last of the luck-bane arrows as full darkness settled outside. 50 in total, each carefully placed in a quiver near the forge's main door. The trap mechanisms were set, the doors reinforced, the windows barred with iron grates he'd forged himself. It should be enough. It had to be enough. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Leo lay on a cot in the forge's living quarters, listening to the sounds of the guild district settling into uneasy quiet. Ilara slept fitfully nearby, her breathing occasionally hitching as dreams troubled her. Through the small, barred window, he could see the moon, a sliver of silver in a sky choked with clouds. His mind kept returning to the numbers. 9,722 failures by nightfall. He'd done pulls until his hands were numb, until the mechanical rhythm of feeding coins into the machine became a meditation. 278 to go. Then the system would break again, and something divine would fall into his hands. A material for the legendary sword he needed to craft, the weapon that would truly disrupt Vex's monopoly. But first, he had to survive the assault. Dawn came gray and damp. Leo was already at work when the first guild guard knocked on the forge door, a sharp, urgent rap that broke the morning's stillness. Movement in the eastern alleys, the guard reported, his face grim under his helmet. At least 20 men, maybe more. They're wearing Vex colors. Leo nodded, his throat dry. He moved to the gacha machine, his hands steady as he fed it coin after coin. Failure 9,800. 9,900. The numbers climbed with terrifying speed, each whir of the machine sounding louder in the tense quiet. Elara prepared her potions, lining them up on a table near the rear exit. Stamina recovery, pain-numbing, one that would induce temporary blindness if thrown as a grenade. Her hands shook slightly, but her movements remained precise. Through the day, reports trickled in. Vex forces were positioning themselves around the guild district, not yet breaching its boundaries but forming a loose cordon. Merchants closed their shops early. The streets emptied. By afternoon, even the usual sounds of commerce had faded, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the distant bark of orders. Leo worked through it all. He adjusted trap mechanisms, tested door reinforcements, sharpened the luck-bane arrows until their imperfect edges gleamed in the forge light. His failure counter climbed, 9,950. 9,975. As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, Lysandra returned with Corin in tow. The guild attendant's ink-stained fingers clutched a ledger, his normally cheerful face pale with anxiety. "They're coming tonight," Lysandra said. "Our scouts confirm it. Vex isn't hiding his movements anymore. He's brought an enforcer, a brute named Grom. Former arena fighter, known for breaking sieges single-handedly." Leo didn't pause in his work. He fed another coin into the gacha machine. 9,998. The machine whirred, spat out a pebble. 9,999. One more. Just one more failure, and the system would break. Guaranteed ultimate pity would trigger, and he'd have his divine material. He could craft the sword, end this properly instead of just defending. He reached for the last copper coin in his pouch, his fingers closing around its worn edges. The forge around him felt suddenly still, as if holding its breath. Elara watched from her station, a potion bottle half raised. Lysandra and Corin stood frozen near the door. Even the guild guards outside had fallen silent. This was it. The moment everything he'd suffered for, the 10,000 initial failures that broke him, the ridicule, the bankruptcy, the forced retirement, all of it led to this threshold. His bad luck had become a weapon, his curse a cheat code written into the world's very fabric. He slid the coin into the machine's slot. The mechanisms engaged with their familiar whir, gears turning, something clunking deep within the housing. Leo waited, his heart pounding against his ribs. 1 second. 2. Then the forge's alarm wards blared, a piercing shriek of magical sound that shattered the stillness. Through the barred windows, torchlight bloomed in the streets outside, casting dancing shadows against the walls. Shouts echoed, the clash of steel on steel, the thud of bodies hitting cobblestones. And a voice roared above the chaos, deep and brutal, carrying through stone and ward alike, Leo. "Come out and die, luckless smith. Baron Vex sends his regards." The assault had begun. The crash echoed through the forge like a thunderclap, rattling tools on their hooks and sending a shower of dust from the rafters. Leo ducked behind his anvil, the divine hammer clutched tight in his hand. Through the smoke and debris, he saw the outer door, reinforced oak with iron bands, splinter inward, hanging from a single hinge. Grom stood in the wreckage, a mountain of muscle holding a warhammer that looked more like a small tree trunk with an iron head. Moonlight from the shattered doorway glinted off his bald scalp and the crude tattoos snaking up his arms. Behind him, soldiers poured through the opening, their armor clanking, swords drawn. 10, maybe 12 of them, all wearing Baron Vex's crest, a clenched fist gripping coins. Found you, Blacksmith. Grom's voice was a gravelly rumble, barely audible over the alarm wards that still screamed from the walls. The magical runes etched around the forge perimeter glowed red, then flickered and died as one of Vex's alchemists outside tossed a vial of shimmering liquid that hissed against the stone. Elara was already moving, her green robes a blur as she darted behind a stack of crates. She pulled a small clay pot from her belt, one of her last herbal smoke bombs, but hesitated. The forge was too enclosed, the smoke would choke them all. Stay back. Leo shouted, though he knew it was useless. His eyes scanned the room. 50 luckbane arrows lay in a quiver by the furnace, their tips gleaming dully. Various traps he'd rigged, tripwires connected to falling anvils, pressure plates that would release boiling water, were already being disarmed by Vex soldiers with practiced efficiency. They'd studied his defenses. Grom took a step forward, his boots crunching on broken wood. Baron wants your head. And that fancy sword you made. He hefted the warhammer. Might take the hammer too. Looks valuable. Leo's mind raced. The divine hammer in his hand felt warm, almost vibrating with anticipation. His failure counter stood at 9,999. One more pull. One more failure. But the gacha machines were across the room, near the storage shelves now blocked by 3 soldiers. And Grom was closing fast. Elara, the side door. Leo yelled, pointing to the small service entrance behind the quenching trough. She shook her head, her face pale but determined. Warded shut. They must have sealed it from outside. Grom chuckled. Smart, aren't we? Baron paid good money for those counterwards. He took another step, his soldiers fanning out to flank them. Now, how about you? Leo didn't wait for the rest. He threw himself sideways, rolling behind the anvil just as Grom's warhammer came down where he'd been standing. Stone floor cracked, sending spiderweb fractures across the flagstones. The impact jarred Leo's teeth, but he kept moving, scrambling toward the nearest gacha machine, a small, battered or dispenser he'd kept for sentimental reasons. It was a ridiculous model, barely waist-high, with a rusted coin slot and a cracked glass display showing faded pictures of common iron and copper ores. Leo had pulled from it 10,000 times before his first pity drop. It had taken his last copper coin back then. Now, he didn't even need currency, the Merchants Guild had wired it for unlimited pulls. Stop him. Grom bellowed, but his soldiers were momentarily confused. Why was the blacksmith running toward a junk gacha machine instead of fighting or fleeing? Leo reached the machine, his hands trembling not from fear but from exhaustion. He'd been working for days without proper rest, forging arrows, setting traps, his muscles screaming in protest. The divine hammer's minor crafting boost had kept him going, but even that had limits. He could feel his stamina draining, a hollow ache in his bones. He slammed his palm against the pull lever. The machine whirred, gears grinding with a sound like grinding teeth. A light on its top blinked yellow, processing. Leo held his breath. This was it. The 10,000th failure. The guaranteed ultimate pity. The light turned red. A failure chime dinged, tinny and pathetic. And then the world seemed to pause. The air in the forge grew heavy, thick with a pressure that made Leo's ears pop. The gacha machine shuddered, its rusted casing groaning as if in pain. Cracks appeared in the glass display, spreading like frost across a window. From within, a light began to glow, not the cheap yellow of the machine's bulbs, but a deep, molten gold that pulsed with heat Leo could feel from 3 feet away. Grom and his soldiers froze, staring. Even Elara peered from behind her crates, her eyes wide. The machine exploded. Not with violence, but with a soft, sighing release of energy. Shards of glass and metal fell away like petals from a dying flower, and there, hovering where the dispenser tray should have been, was a chunk of metal the size of Leo's fist. It was like nothing he'd ever seen. Dark as polished obsidian, yet it seemed to drink the light around it, leaving a faint shimmer in the air. Veins of silver ran through it in intricate patterns that shifted when Leo blinked, as if alive. It radiated cold, not the chill of ice, but the absolute zero of something that had never known warmth. Adamantine core. The name came to Leo unbidden, whispered by the divine hammer in his hand. A legendary metal. Indestructible by normal means. The ultimate material for defense. What in the hells, Grom started, but Leo was already moving. He snatched the adamantine core from the air. It was heavier than it looked, dense beyond reason, yet it felt right in his grip. The divine hammer seemed to sing against it, a high, clear note that resonated in Leo's bones. Ilara. The furnace. Maximum heat. Leo barked, stumbling toward his main forge. She didn't question. She darted out, ignoring the soldiers who were still staring in confusion, and threw a handful of glowing herbs into the furnace. The coals roared to life, flames leaping up in blues and whites, alchemical enhancement. Heat washed over Leo's face, sweat beading on his forehead instantly. He placed the adamantine core on his anvil. It sat there, inert, refusing to even warm from proximity to the furnace. Leo raised the divine hammer. His arms felt like lead. His vision blurred at the edges. The last of his stamina was a dwindling pool, and he was dipping into reserves he didn't know he had. But he brought the hammer down. The impact rang through the forge like a bell tolling midnight. Sparks flew, not the orange sparks of iron, but silver and gold ones that hung in the air like fireflies. The adamantine core didn't flatten. It flowed. Under the divine hammer's touch, the metal spread like liquid shadow, thinning, expanding, taking shape. Leo worked without thought, without plan. His hands moved on instinct, guided by centuries of smithing knowledge that wasn't his own, the forgotten god's legacy flowing through the hammer. He folded the metal, hammered it smooth, curved it into a wide, kite-shaped form. A shield. He didn't add straps or grips. He didn't need to. As he worked, the metal seemed to understand his intent. Handles formed of their own accord, perfectly molded to his grip. The surface, initially matte black, began to gleam with an inner light, soft silver patterns emerging like constellations on a night sky. It took minutes. Maybe less. Time lost meaning in the rhythm of hammer strikes and the roar of the furnace. When Leo finally stepped back, panting, his vision swimming, the shield lay on the anvil, complete. It was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. 3 feet tall, 2 wide, with edges so sharp they seemed to cut the air around them. The adamantine core's dark base was now shot through with those silver veins, pulsing gently with a light that had no source. The divine hammer's minor crafting boost had done more than just speed the work, it had infused the shield with something extra. A faint, shimmering aura clung to its surface, visible only at the corner of Leo's eye. Enough of this. Grom's roar shattered the moment. The enforcer had recovered from his shock, his face twisted in rage. He hefted his warhammer and charged, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides. His soldiers snapped to attention, moving to cut off any escape. Leo didn't try to escape. He grabbed the shield. It was lighter than it should have been, balanced perfectly. The handles fit his hands as if grown there. He raised it just as Grom brought the warhammer down in an overhead smash that would have crushed stone. The impact was a sound beyond sound, a deep, resonant boom that shook the forge to its foundations. Dust rained from the ceiling. Tools fell from walls. Ilara cried out, covering her ears. Leo's knees buckled. The force traveled through the shield, through his arms, into his bones. He felt something crack, a rib, maybe. Pain lanced through his chest. But he held. The warhammer shattered. Not just broke. Shattered. The iron head, thick as a dinner plate, exploded into 1,000 fragments that pinged off walls and armor. The wooden handle splintered into kindling. Grom stared at the stump in his hands, his expression one of pure, uncomprehending shock. The shield hadn't moved. Not an inch. Its surface gleamed, unmarked, the silver veins pulsing a little brighter. The shimmering aura around it flared, then settled. Silence. Then chaos. Grom stumbled back, his confidence broken. Kill him, he screamed, but the command lacked conviction. The soldiers hesitated. They'd seen their leader's best blow stopped cold, his weapon destroyed by a shield that looked like it belonged in a temple, not a forge. That hesitation was all the guild guards needed. They poured in from the streets outside, 10 of them in polished armor, their swords already drawn. They'd been waiting, holding back until the right moment. Lyssandra's orders, no doubt. The remaining Vex soldiers, already demoralized, put up token resistance before dropping their weapons and surrendering. Grom tried to fight. He grabbed a fallen sword and swung at the nearest guard, but his heart wasn't in it. 2 guards disarmed him easily, forcing him to his knees. Leo lowered the shield. His arms trembled with exhaustion. Every muscle screamed. He looked at the adamantine shield in his hands, then at the divine hammer still clutched in his other. The two felt connected, like parts of a whole. Elara rushed to his side. "You're hurt," she said, her hands already glowing with healing herbs she'd saved for emergencies. "Just bruised," Leo managed, though the pain in his chest said otherwise. He leaned against the anvil, the cool metal a relief against his back. The guild guard secured the prisoners, herding them outside. The forge was a wreck, shattered door, broken tools, the remains of the gacha machine scattered across the floor. But they'd held. They'd survived. As the dust began to settle, footsteps echoed from the doorway. Lysandra entered, her merchant's robes immaculate despite the late hour. She surveyed the damage with a critical eye, her expression unreadable. "Impressive," she said, her gaze lingering on the adamantine shield. "But the fight's not over." Leo straightened, wincing. "Vex will send more. He already has." Lysandra's voice was grim. "Not soldiers. Paperwork." She pulled a scroll from her sleeve, its seal broken. "He's petitioned the regional council. Claims your crafts are economically destabilizing. That they violate fair trade laws. There's a hearing in 3 days." Leo stared at her. "A hearing? If they rule against you, they'll ban your work. Confiscate your tools. Possibly arrest you for market manipulation." Lysandra's eyes met his. "This isn't a war of hammers anymore, Leo. It's a war of words. And Baron Vex has better lawyers than he has soldiers." Outside, the first light of dawn tinged the sky gray. The shield in Leo's hands felt suddenly heavier, its divine light seeming to dim against the coming bureaucratic battle. The carriage wheels clattered over cobblestones as Leo stared out at the capital city of Silver Vale. Grand spires pierced the morning mist, their gilded edges catching the first rays of sunlight. Beside him, the adamantine shield rested against the seat, its polished surface reflecting the passing cityscape in distorted fragments. In his lap, he cradled Ember's promise, the first dagger he'd forged from Spydor, its blade still holding the faint glow that had started everything. Lysandra sat across from him, her merchant's robes crisp and unrumbled despite the journey. "Remember," she said, her voice low but clear over the carriage noise, "the council hall is a theater. Every gesture, every word will be weighed by those watching. Baron Vex has already filled half the gallery with his supporters." Leo's fingers traced the edge of Ember's promise. The metal felt cool despite its name. "And the other half?" "The desperate," Lysandra answered without hesitation. "Farmers who've lost their land to gacha debts. Craftsmen whose workshops failed after one bad pull season. Merchants squeezed out by Vex monopoly. They've come because rumors of your crafts have spread, tales of items that didn't come from the usual luck-based suffering." The carriage slowed, turning into a wide plaza dominated by the council hall. The building rose in marble tiers, each level marked with intricate carvings depicting the gacha system's supposed benevolence, angels distributing scrolls, merchants shaking hands over glowing orbs, nobles overseeing fair exchanges. Leo's eyes narrowed at the last carving, a noble's hand resting heavily on a commoner's shoulder, the commoner's face turned downward. Guards in polished armor flanked the entrance, their spears gleaming. As Leo stepped down, the adamantine shield caught the light, throwing a sharp reflection across the plaza. A murmur rippled through the gathering crowd. He saw faces in the throng, some curious, some hostile, many with the hollow-eyed look of people who'd gambled their last copper and lost. Inside, the hall took his breath away. Vaulted ceilings soared 3 stories high, supported by columns carved to resemble twisting vines of gold and silver. Stained glass windows cast colored patterns across the marble floor, each depicting a different aspect of the gacha economy. The air smelled of polished wood, incense, and the faint metallic tang of anxiety. Tiers of seating rose on either side of a central aisle. To the left, Baron Vex's faction occupied the front rows, nobles in silks, merchants with calculating eyes, officials in stiff uniforms. Vex himself sat at the center, his face a mask of composed authority, but Leo noticed the tightness around his eyes. Silas stood behind him, leaning forward to whisper something that made Vex's jaw clench. To the right, the commoners' gallery overflowed. Farmers in patched tunics, blacksmiths with soot-stained hands, herbalists like Ilara who traveled from neighboring towns. Their eyes followed Leo as he walked down the aisle, carrying his items like offerings to some strange altar. At the front, a semicircular dais held the council members, 7 elders in robes of state, their faces lined with the weight of decisions. The center seat belonged to High Counselor Valerius, an old man with white hair and eyes that missed nothing. Leo of the Forge, Valerius's voice echoed through the hall without need for amplification. You stand before this council to answer Baron Vex's petition to ban your crafts as economically destabilizing. Present your evidence. Leo placed the adamantine shield on the evidence table first. It landed with a solid thunk that silenced the remaining whispers. Then Ember's promise, its glow seeming to brighten in the hall's light. He took a breath, feeling the eyes of hundreds upon him. Vex rose smoothly. Honored counselors, he began, his voice practiced and smooth. For generations, our society has thrived on the gacha system, a fair, randomized distribution of resources that allows anyone, from noble to farmer, equal chance at prosperity. But this man, he gestured toward Leo without looking at him, has discovered a flaw. A way to bypass the system's randomness. His items, crafted from materials obtained through what he calls pity drops, undermine the very foundation of our economy. He paced before the dais, his robes swirling. Consider the spite or dagger. Crafted from material that should not exist through normal means. Sold for a fortune that destabilized local material prices. Then the adamantine shield, forged in minutes from legendary metal that should take years of dedicated pulls to acquire. If every craftsman could do this, what becomes of our markets? What becomes of the thousands who invest their livelihoods in the gacha system? Murmurs of agreement came from Vex's side. A merchant in the front row nodded vigorously, his jowls shaking. Leo waited until Vex finished, until the echo of his last word faded. Then he stepped forward, not to the center of the floor, but toward the commoners' gallery. He lifted Ember's promise, turning it so the light caught the blade. This, he said, his voice quieter than Vex but carrying in the sudden silence, was forged from my 10,000th failure. He paused, letting the number sink in. 10,000 consecutive pulls without a single useful material. 10,000 times watching the glow fade to disappointment. 10,000 reasons to give up. He turned to face the council. Baron Vex speaks of fairness. But what's fair about a farmer losing his land because the seed gacha gave him rocks instead of wheat? What's fair about a blacksmith closing his forge because the ore gacha yielded only dust for a year? The system isn't broken because I found a way around it, it was already broken. My misfortune just made the cracks visible. A woman in the commoners' gallery stood up. Her hands were calloused from fieldwork. My family lost our farm last winter, she said, her voice trembling but clear. 3 bad harvests because the weather gacha scrolls failed. We pulled every week, spent our savings. The system promised chance, but all we got was loss. Others began speaking, their voices overlapping. My son's tuition, gone to skillbook gachas that gave him nothing. The town well dried up after the water purification crystal gacha failed 10 times running. The healer's clinic closed when the herb gacha yielded poison ivy instead of healing plants. The council members exchanged glances. Valerius raised a hand, and the hall quieted, but the energy had shifted. Leo could feel it, a current of shared frustration that Vex's polished arguments couldn't contain. Over the next 3 days, the hearing stretched into a marathon of debates. Leo spent mornings in the council hall, afternoons in a temporary workshop the guild had secured, and evenings walking the capital streets. Everywhere, he saw gacha machines, glowing orbs in market squares, scroll dispensers in libraries, material vendors with their random pull counters. And everywhere, he saw people pulling, hoping, losing. On the second day, while waiting for a procedural delay, Leo found a public ore gacha machine near the council hall. He fed it a copper, a tiny, almost invisible failure among the day's proceedings. The machine whirred, glowed faintly, and produced a chunk of brittle shale. Leo pocketed it without expression, but inside, he counted, failure number 12 since resetting his counter after the adamantine shield. That evening, Lysandra joined him in the workshop. Vex is pushing for complete prohibition, she reported, unrolling a scroll of notes. He's brought in economists who claim your pity-driven crafts could collapse material markets within a year. But the commoner's testimony is having an effect. 2 council members have started asking about reform instead of ban. Leo worked at a small forge, heating a piece of common iron. Not to craft anything useful, just to feel the hammer in his hand, to remember why he'd started this. What if, he said between strikes, instead of banning me, they fixed the system? Lyssandra's eyebrows rose. Explain. The guaranteed ultimate pity triggers after 10,000 failures. That's not cheating, that's the system admitting its own cruelty. What if the council mandated pity thresholds for all gachas? Not as extreme as mine, but something. A guaranteed useful pull after 100 failures. After 50. After 10. He let the hammer fall one last time, then held up the twisted, useless piece of metal. This is what most people get, most of the time. But it doesn't have to be that way. On the 3rd day, Leo stood before the council for the final session. He'd brought not just his items, but a ledger Lysandra had helped compile, records of material price fluctuations, testimonies from towns affected by Vex monopoly, data on failure rates across different gacha types. I'll make you an offer, Leo said, looking at each counselor in turn. Regulate my output. License my crafts. Set limits on how many pity-driven items I can produce each year. In return, the council reforms the gacha system. Implement pity thresholds. Audit the pull rates Vex and other monopolists claim are fair. Make the randomness actually random, not weighted toward those who can afford to pull thousands of times. Vex shot to his feet. Preposterous. You'd have this council reward your cheating with special privileges. But Councillor Valerius was studying Leo's ledger. He passed it to the woman on his right, who frowned at a page showing how Vex had inflated gacha prices by 40% after Leo's first dagger sold. The debate lasted hours. Leo watched as alliances shifted. A merchant who'd supported Vex yesterday whispered with a farmer's representative today. A gacha system official argued for maintaining purity of chance, but even he stumbled when asked to explain why some nobles seemed to have consistently better luck than commoners. When Valerius finally called for a vote, the compromise emerged like a blade from a forge. Leo would receive a limited crafting license, allowing him to produce up to 3 pity-driven items per year, each subject to council approval and market impact review. In return, the council would establish a reform commission to investigate gacha rates and implement basic pity thresholds within 6 months. And for Baron Vex, sanctions. Fines for monopolistic practices, mandatory audits of his gacha operations, and temporary suspension of his exclusive vendor rights in 3 districts. Vex's face went pale, then flushed with anger. He left the hall without a word, Silas trailing behind him like a shadow. As the hall emptied, Leo gathered his items. The adamantine shield felt lighter than it had 3 days ago, as if some weight had been lifted. Commoners approached him, not to ask for crafts, but to thank him for speaking. A young apprentice blacksmith shyly showed him a piece of metal she'd pulled that morning, her first semi-decent ore in months. Lysandra appeared at his side as he stepped into the plaza. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the stones. A good outcome, she said, but her voice held a tension that hadn't been there before. What is it? Leo asked. She drew him away from the dispersing crowd, into the shadow of a column where the stained glass light didn't reach. While you were in session today, Corin sent a message from the guild archives. A man has been asking questions in the capital's lower districts. Not about you specifically, but about statistical anomalies in the gacha system. Leo's grip tightened on Ember's promise. What kind of man? No one got a clear look. He wore gray robes that didn't show his face. But he paid in perfect silver coins, minted with symbols none of our merchants recognize. And he knew terms only system architects should know. Pity triggers. Failure accumulation algorithms. Divergent probability streams. She met his eyes. The creators of the gacha system have protocols for when someone breaks their rules. Protocols that don't involve council hearings or legal petitions. In the distance, a bell tolled the hour. The sound echoed through the plaza, but to Leo, it sounded less like timekeeping and more like a warning. The familiar scent of coal and hot metal welcomed Leo back to his forge, but this time it carried the weight of purpose rather than desperation. The council's limited license, 3 pity-driven items per year, hung on the wall like both a trophy and a shackle. He ran a calloused hand over the adamantine shield leaning against the anvil, its surface still bearing the faint memory of Grom's shattered warhammer. In the corner, the phoenix feather remnants glowed with a soft, persistent warmth in their protective case. Leo's mind calculated. His failure counter, meticulously tracked on a slate by the gacha machine, now read 10,500. Each number represented a copper spent, a hope dashed, a moment where the world told him he was cursed. But now they were fuel. The divine hammer, resting on its stand, seemed to hum in anticipation. This isn't just another item, Leo thought, his eyes tracing the lines of the adamantine core. The legendary metal, won through 10,000 failures, pulsed with a deep, resonant energy that vibrated through the stone floor. This is the answer. The one that changes everything. He spent the first day preparing. Not with frantic haste, but with the deliberate precision of a master who knew this would be his defining work. The forge needed to be perfect, the bellows oiled, the quenching trough filled with spring water Elara had blessed with her herbal mixtures, every tool aligned within reach. When he finally lifted the adamantine core, its weight surprised him. Not heavy like iron, but dense with potential, as if containing entire mountains compressed into a palm-sized ingot. Elara arrived at dawn on the second day, her satchel bulging with freshly gathered herbs. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, she'd been brewing through the night. Stamina recovery, pain suppression, focus enhancement, she said, lining up vials on the workbench. I've doubled the concentrations. You'll need them. Leo nodded, already feeling the first tremors of what this forging would demand. He placed the adamantine core in the forge's heart, stoking the coals until they glowed white-hot. The metal didn't melt so much as soften, becoming malleable like clay while retaining its structural integrity. When he lifted it with tongs, it shone with an inner light that cast long, sharp shadows across the workshop. The divine hammer felt different in his grip this time. Not just a tool, but an extension of his will. As he brought it down on the adamantine core for the first strike, the impact resonated through his bones with a clear, bell-like tone that lingered in the air. With each subsequent blow, the metal began to take shape, first the rough outline of a blade, then the gradual taper toward a point, the careful formation of a fuller along its length. By the third day, Leo's body screamed in protest. His muscles burned, his hands blistered despite years of calluses, and sweat soaked through his leather apron. Elara forced potions between his lips during brief pauses, the bitter herbs cutting through the haze of exhaustion. The minor crafting boost from the divine hammer worked constantly, but it felt like trying to channel a river through a straw. The adamantine core demanded more. On the fourth day, he introduced the phoenix feather remnants. They weren't metal, but something between essence and memory. As he laid them along the blade's spine during a critical heating phase, they didn't burn but instead fused with the adamantine, creating veins of crimson light that pulsed like slow heartbeats within the steel. The workshop filled with the scent of sun-warmed stone and distant ashes. Leo lost track of time. The world narrowed to the rhythm of hammer strikes, the dance of heat and cooling, the gradual emergence of something that felt alive in his hands. Sometimes he'd pause, staring at the blade taking form, and wonder if this was what the forgotten smithing god had felt, not just making a tool, but giving shape to an idea. On the seventh day, as dawn light filtered through the forge's high windows, Leo performed the final quenching. He lifted the completed blade with trembling arms and plunged it into the blessed water. Steam erupted in a hissing cloud that smelled of ozone and possibility. When he withdrew it, the sword gleamed with an ethereal light that seemed to come from within rather than reflect without. Pity's edge, he whispered, the name coming to him fully formed. The blade was lighter than it should be, balanced perfectly in his grip. Along its length, the adamantine shone with a cool silver radiance, while the phoenix feather remnants created crimson patterns that shifted when viewed from different angles, like embers in a dying fire. But more than its appearance was its presence, a quiet hum that vibrated at the edge of hearing, a sensation of sharpness that seemed to cut the air itself. As Leo held it aloft, something strange happened. The gacha machine in the corner flickered, its display glitching with static. Outside, through the open forge door, he heard shouts from the street as other gacha machines in nearby shops began malfunctioning, lights flashing erratically, mechanisms jamming, displays showing impossible combinations. The effect lasted only minutes, but in that time, the entire district's gacha infrastructure stuttered like a heart skipping beats. Elara stared, her herbalist senses detecting the metaphysical disturbance. "It's rejecting the system," she said, awe in her voice. "The sword, it's made from what the system failed to provide." Word spread faster than fire. By midday, a crowd had gathered outside the forge, merchants and commoners alike drawn by rumors of a blade that made gacha machines tremble. Lysandra arrived with guild attendants, her merchant's instincts already calculating the implications. "We'll hold the auction in the town square," she declared. "Public. Transparent. Let everyone see what true craftsmanship looks like when it's not bound to chance." The auction took place 3 days later under a clear autumn sky. The town square, usually dominated by the central gacha pavilion where Baron Vex agents collected their fees, now hosted a simple wooden platform. Leo stood at its center, Pity's edge resting on a velvet-lined stand. The crowd numbered in the hundreds, blacksmiths who'd mocked him, merchants who'd refused him credit, commoners who'd shared his failures in the council hearing. Lysandra conducted the bidding with merciless efficiency. Starting price, 1,000 gold crowns, more than most earned in a lifetime. The first bid came from a weapons merchant from the next region over. Then another. Then a noble's representative. The numbers climbed, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000. As the bids passed 15,000, something shifted in the crowd. Weapons merchants began whispering urgently to their assistants. By 20,000, several left the square entirely, running to their shops. By the time the gavel fell at 25,000 gold crowns to a collector from the distant capital, the regional market for swords had already begun to collapse. Buyers who'd been saving for gacha pulls for months, even years, now abandoned those plans. Why spend fortunes on chance when Leo's blade, visible, tangible, and demonstrably superior, existed? Within hours, sword prices in every shop and market stall plummeted. Gacha machines offering blade pulls sat unused, their operators staring at empty queues. Baron Vex watched from the shadows of a balcony, his face pale. His monopoly, built on controlling the region's gacha sales, crumbled as people realized there was another way. When Leo's payment, 25,000 gold crowns in guild-certified notes, was publicly displayed, Vex turned and disappeared into his manor. By nightfall, witnesses reported seeing him flee the region with only a single carriage, his once imposing estate left to silent halls and unpaid servants. Leo stood in his forge that evening, the weight of the coins meaning less than the weight of the moment. He'd done it. Not just made a sword, but changed the rules. Over the following weeks, he used a portion of the profits to establish what he called the Community Forge, a workshop open to anyone willing to learn, with proper tools, materials, and most importantly, no gacha requirements. Apprentice blacksmiths who'd struggled for years to get decent or through pulls now worked with consistent quality materials. Leo taught them not just technique, but how to see beyond the system that had defined their lives. One crisp evening, as the first stars appeared above the forge's chimney, Leo shared a quiet meal with Alara and Lysandra in the workshop's living quarters. A simple stew, good bread, and the satisfaction of work that mattered. They spoke of the future, of expanding the community forge, of Alara's plans for an herb garden that didn't rely on gacha seeds, of Lysandra's negotiations with other guild chapters. Then a knock sounded at the door. A guild messenger stood there, holding a sealed letter on heavy parchment. The wax seal wasn't the guild's emblem, nor the regional council's. It showed a complex geometric pattern of interlocking gears and probability symbols, and it glowed with a soft, ominous light that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. The messenger's hand trembled slightly as he passed it to Leo. "From the capital," the messenger said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The creators of the gacha system. They demand an audience." Leo took the letter. The parchment felt unnaturally warm, and the glowing emblem cast shifting shadows on his face. He didn't open it immediately, just held it as the celebration around him fell silent. Outside, the town continued its new rhythm, the clang of hammers from the community forge, the chatter of merchants selling at fair prices, the absence of gacha machines whirring in every shop. The regional economy had changed forever. But as the emblem pulsed in his hands, Leo understood, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a different kind of fight.